way or the other, and filled with a desire to discover the truth and evolve some constructive measures to improve the situation, which gives concern to all the friends of Poland. I am, my dear Mr. Morgenthau, with every hope that your mission may result in lasting good. Very sincerely yours, Robert Lansing. Our commission arrived in Warsaw on the 13th of July, and we were immediately immersed in the vortex of Polish affairs. The Jewish masses looked upon us as hoped for deliverers, and upon me as a second Moses Montefiore, but no other faction was pleased at our presence. Hadoruski's request that we be sent was far from representing the wishes of the entire Polish people. The majority of the government, particularly Duchy, the chief of state, and his group had difficulty in concealing their mistrust of the mission, and a large portion of the press unreservedly described our purpose as a piece of uncalled for interference. As no enduring benefit was likely to be accomplished unless we won the goodwill of all concerned, we saw at once that to secure this was only secondary to our discovering the truth. Accordingly, as soon as we were settled in the Rakzinski Palace, where the Poles signed their Declaration of Independence in 1790, we began a long series of conferences with men from all the political factions, persons of the various religious faiths, members of the cabinet and parliament, the Volkspartei, the Arbeiterverein, and with Jews, Zionistic, assimilators, and Orthodox. Of the Jewish members of the parliament there were Dr. Greinenbaum, Dr. Thon, Mr. Farbstein, Hartglas, Dr. Rosenblatt, who were nationalistic Zionists, Dr. Weinzer, who was a radical Zionist, and Dr. Skipper, who was a socialistic Zionist. Then there were Paludsky and Hersthorn of the Volkspartei, and Rabbis Perlmutter and Halpin of the Orthodox Jewish Party. Our quarters were flooded with visitors. To our first sitting came representatives of the Zionists to state their case, and then the picturesque Rabbi Perlmutter, with his white, patriarchal beard, who, accompanied by two other rabbis, called to extend the welcome of the Orthodox Jews. That was the beginning of a full fortnight of Warsaw hearings. Day after day, we sat there, listening, questioning, taking voluminous notes, making bulky records. There came representatives from the Jews of Lodz, Lemberg, Krakow, Vilna, and other towns, each delegation with its own story, in each entreating us to visit its city and conduct personal investigations there. The story of the men from Minsk is worth repeating. They claimed possession of definite information of a conspiracy against them whereby, when the Polish army should enter Minsk, anti-Semitic Bolshevist soldiers, lagging in the rear of the Bolsheviks' retreat, would
fly
at the conquerors from houses occupied by Jews, so that the Jews would be blamed and pogroms result. They even gave the location of the houses. Thus it went from morning until night. One day there were 10 different delegations, each important, each interesting to be listened to. It was not long before we found, to our surprise, that the chief sources of trouble could be traced to a comparatively few factional leaders, not more than would fill a small room, and that for these the opportunity to express their clashing views was in itself a relief to the tenseness of the situation. In a class by himself, however, was Rabbi Rubinstein, who came from Vilna when we were in the middle of one of our endless conferences with Warsaw Zionists. He was a Lithuanian, and though he had been flogged for refusing to sign a paper charging the Bolsheviki with the Vilna outrages, he was still defiant toward the Poles. Learned in more than Jewish scholarship, he had a grasp of the economic laws involved in the present difficulties and a keen understanding of world politics that was touched with statesmanship. But above all, he was the shepherd pleading for his sheep. He displayed a pathetic faith that here at last was a tribunal anxious to dispense justice. Imagine a face like that of some medieval artists.
Christ,
lined with the horror of his recent experiences, eyes wide with the grief that they had suffered in witnessing the massacre of the flower of his flock. His gesturing hands shook, his voice was broken by emotion, but he recounted the history of these now well-known Vilna excesses with an eloquence that was all the more moving because it was wholly unstudied, and every now and then the current of his speech was broken by spasmodic ebullitions of resentment which he could no longer repress. He begged us not to make the mistake of previous hasty investigators. He implored us to spend at least 3 days in Vilna. His community had retained 2 lawyers who had collected all the evidence. Everything would be thoroughly prepared, but there were so many witnesses to be examined that a 3 days sojourn was the minimum necessity. Here, it was clear, was no religious fanatic. His plea was so brilliant, his sincerity so convincing, that we readily agreed with his request. I have said that the Zionists were our first callers. They were also our most constant. We were soon in close contact with all their leaders, attended their meetings, and studied their activities. Some were pro-Russian, all were practically non-Polish, and the Zionism of most of them was simply advocacy of Jewish nationalism within the Polish state. Thus, when the Committee of the Gem, or Polish Constitutional Assembly, called on us, led by Grein and Baden, Farbstein and Thon, all men who had discarded the dress and beard of the Orthodox Jew, and when I discovered that they were really authorized to represent that section of the Jews that had complained to the world of their alleged pogroms, I notified them that we were willing to give them several hours a day until they had completed the presentation of their case to their entire satisfaction. That program was adhered to. Besides their version of the excesses, they presented evidence of considerable political bad faith and much economic oppression on the part of a section of the Poles, contrary to explicit understanding. An election had been set for the Jewish Sabbath, and there had been gerrymandering by a listock, so that in the municipal election the Jewish votes had been swamped by voters admitted from surrounding villages. We were told of the development of cooperative stores, which both excluded the Jews as members and were pledged against patronizing Jewish wholesale merchants or manufacturers.
But
We asked.
You don't expect to end these things by propaganda for an exodus to Palestine?
They admitted that taking anything short of 50,000 Jews a year out of Poland would effect no noticeable decrease in the population there. They were afraid that the government intended to treat the Jews in the old way, and that they would not be given rights equal to those of other Polish citizens if they could not go to Palestine. If they were to be regarded as a foreign mass in Polish body politic, they wanted the privileges that they felt ought to be granted them, to offset the privations of such a situation. To that end they were employing the Zionist agitation.
We want,
They said,
to be permitted to vote for Jewish representatives no matter what part of the country we or they live in.
the Jews form 14% of Poland's population. We want a 14% representation in Poland's parliament. That will give us 56 members instead of the 11 Jewish members there at present.
They admitted that their 56 could sway legislation only in case of close divisions among the other parties. Then there were the assimilators, whose attitude was the extreme opposite of the Zionists. They invited us to a reception, and we found them very intelligent and deeply interested in the future of Poland, distinct in no detail of dress or speech, and holding membership in political parties on purely Polish principles, just as a Jew in America may be a Democrat or a Republican without reference to his religion. They regarded Judaism as a matter of faith. They were prosperous. Many of them were professional men, and all of them mingled on a footing of social equality with the Christians. The meeting of the old order with the new presented many a contrast. I recall particularly the reception of which the Countess Zamoyski, representing the ancient aristocracy, was one of the attractions. That was like an episode under Louis Roman XIV transported and touched into the modern world. Amid ornate decorations, lavish refreshments, excellent music, and displays of fireworks, the pretty countess presided with all the grace and charm of a lady at the court of the Grand Monarch. Beside her towered General Pilsudski, the gruff and bluff chief of state of the new Polish regime. The old aristocracy was flirting with the modern forces in power, and the modernists, more than a little flattered, were by no means repelling these charming attentions. Nothing could have been more interesting. While ambassador at Constantinople, I had seen the disintegration of Turkey. In Paris I had been present at the obsequies of the German and Austrian MPs. Here I was attending a christening with parents and godparents, nursery governesses and prospective tutors and guardians, all discussing the child's career. Our escort M. Skarzinski, the acting foreign secretary, turned to me.
In judging the Poles,
He said in that soft, musical voice of his,
you must remember that we are really a sweet and sentimental people.
The new government has not yet assumed the full authority dropped by the Russians. We are still uncertain whether, if we tighten the reins, the horse may balk. Once the horse was the people, now the people are the drivers. We are wondering whether the bit will hurt the tender mouths of the aristocrats.
He was a tall, handsome fellow, this Jarzynski, with the head of a Beethoven and the manners of a Chesterfield. He looked an amateur artist. He was one of those who came into the new government from the old aristocracy, but he never forgot his part as a loyal Republican and evinced an almost boyish pride in his work. One evening we were asked to supper by a certain man of title. His manner was exceedingly cordial and broad-minded, and he had ransacked the entire neighborhood to make his banquet a great success. He had invited some of the prominent Jews of his city. He showed us with great pride a statue of Napoleon by Baden and other fine works of art. Captain Gothic, the counsel of the commission, was sitting with the titled personage's niece, a vivacious girl of about 18.
Just look at Uncle and Aunt,
She whispered.
How charmingly they're treating the ambassador.
They are just loading him down with attentions. It seems strange to me to see a Jew treated with such consideration in our home. You know, I just detest the Jews, don't you?
Well, really?
He said.
I can't possibly agree with you because I am a Jew myself.
The little countess was all confusion.
Don't tell my uncle what I have said.
She begged.
He would never forgive me.
Ashkenazi is another personage of those days whom I shall long remember. One of the great scholars of Limburg University, he was known as the foremost historian of Central Europe. Since then he has become a familiar international figure as Poland's representative at the Geneva meetings of the League of Nations. An occasional attendant at the synagogue, he was nevertheless a pronounced assimilator, and enormously proud of the fact that his family have lived in Poland since 1650. Ashkenazi saw small benefit to anybody in the alleged privileges of educational separation granted the Polish Jews by the treaty.
If the Jews have their own schools,
He said.
that will only widen the difference between them and the Poles.
I reminded him that the separation extended merely to the primary schools.
It will be gradually applied to the high schools,
He insisted.
and then to the universities. In their primary schools, the Jewish children will of course be taught Hebrew or Yiddish. That will make it next to impossible for them to mix with the pupils of the higher grades when they get there.
Very impressive was our visit to the chief synagogue of Warsaw. There must have been 25,000 people present. Outside the building, those clamoring for entrance literally jammed the square and the streets for several blocks surrounding it, from house wall to house wall inside. The crowd was so dense that every man's shoulder overlapped his neighbor's. The cries from the street made it imperative for us to show ourselves there, after the services, when we were almost mobbed. Some of the crowd wanted to pull our automobile to our home, others clamored to carry us there on their shoulders, and something close to good-natured force had to be used to enable us to reach our car. Rubinstein came from Vilna for the meeting. There was a delegation from Posen, and Dr. Thon represented the Jews of the parliament. An eminent nerd specialist from Posen, in his speech, stated that the nervous condition of the Jews should be attributed to
Haloritis.
a fear of what the Polish army under General Hoare might next do to them, while Poznański, the rabbi, in his address, laid stress on the Jews' desire to be first-class and not second-class Polish citizens. This is not the place to recapitulate all the details of our journey through Poland. In Vilna, where our calendar was overcrowded, we got through a really incredible amount of work by running 3 tribunals, each with an investigator, interpreter, and stenographer. The accounts of the evidence of the testimony concerning the outrages to which the Jews had undoubtedly been subjected all the world has long since read. I shall touch only on 3 incidents, those at Stanislawa, Pinsk and Vilna. From Stanislawa, the Christian authorities had asked for a visit from our commission to prevent a provocation of a pogrom by the Jews. When I arrived, the burgomaster explained that the Jews' sympathy with the Ukrainians might provoke an attack of the Polish citizens. I asked,
How is your city governed? By a representative committee of Christians and Jews. How many Christians? 60. And how many Jews? 1.
I said I should like to see that one,
Well,
said the burgomaster.
you see, he wasn't on good terms with the Zionists, and so he had to go.
I sent for a committee of Jewish residents. They told us of their fearful predicament. The governmental control of their city had changed 6 times in 4 years. Each time it changed, the new power, be it Austrian, Polish, or Ukrainian, would punish them for having been loyal to their predecessor. If they remained neutral, or would make them suffer.
What are we to do?
I guess now what the local authorities had been up to. They were anti-Jewish, and if the federal government had not sent somebody in answer to their request, they would have interpreted it as sanctioning of further excesses. I therefore had the burgomaster and his friends in again and declared that the Republic's authorities realized that Poland's standing with the outside world depended on her justice to the Jews.
You are politicians, and I'm a politician.
I concluded.
Therefore we can talk in that language. You've been preparing for a pogrom. Now I want to tell you that your government is as anxious as I am to avoid further maltreatment of the Jews, and if any occurs in Stanislaw, you will be removed from office.
After we had a friendly discussion of the plight in which the local Jews found themselves, the burgomaster assured me that there would be no difficulties in his city, and there were none. I wish that I could adequately describe the scene that I witnessed in Pinsk. It has haunted me ever since, and has seemed a complete expression of the misery and injustice which is prevalent over such a large part of the world today. A few months before our arrival, a particularly atrocious Jewish massacre occurred. A Polish officer, Major Letowski, and 15 of his troops had entered an assembly hall where the leading Jewish residents had gathered as a committee in behalf of the American Joint Distribution Committee to distribute supplies of flour for the 11th Passover bread. The Poles arrested these Jews and marched them hurriedly to the public square, and in the dim light of an automobile lamp, placed 35 of them against the cathedral wall and shot them in cold blood. A somewhat hazy charge had been made that these men were Bolshevists, but no trial was given them, and, indeed, the charge was subsequently shown to be untrue. Returning to the scene of execution on the next morning, the troops found that 3 of their victims were still breathing. These they dispatched, and all the 35 corpses were then thrown into a pit in an old Jewish cemetery, without an opportunity for decent burial or religious exercises, and with nothing to mark their graves. Up to the time that our commission came, not a single Jew had been permitted to visit their cemetery, but I was allowed to inspect the scene of this martyrdom, and when I entered, a great crowd of Jews, who had followed me, also went in. As soon as they reached the burial place of their relatives, they all threw themselves upon the ground and set up a wailing that still rings in my ears. It expressed the misery of centuries. That same evening I attended divine service at the Pinsk synagogue. The building was crowded to its capacity, the men wedged into almost a solid mass. Those that could not enter were gathered outside. All the Jews of Pinsk were there. This was their first opportunity since April to express their grief in their house of worship. This huge mass cried and screamed until it seemed that the heavens would burst. I had read of such public expression of agony in the Old Testament, but this was the first time that I ever completely realized what the collective grief of a persecuted people was like. To me it expressed the misery of centuries and remains a pitiful memory and symbol of the cry for help that is still going forth from a great part of Europe. Who were these 35 victims? They were the leaders of the local Jewish community, the spiritual and moral leaders of the 5,000 Jews in a city, 85% of the population of which was Jewish, the organizers of the charities, the directors of the hospitals, the friends of the poor. And yet, to that incredibly brutal and even more incredibly stupid officer who ordered their execution, there were only so many Jews. Something of the same sort happened at Vilna. There was fighting between the advancing Poles and the retiring Bolsheviki. Shots were fired from private houses against the Polish troops, and the Poles, in the anger of their newfound authority, assumed that the Jewish house owners were guilty. They did not stop to learn the fact that the Jews of Vilna were glad to get rid of Bolshevist rule. They slaughtered or deported all who were suspects, men like Jaff, that Jewish poet who lived in a world of his own beautiful and harmless dreams, were treated shamefully. These descriptions of the occurrences at Pinsk and Vilna are totally inadequate to describe the fearful plight of the Jews. Even the fuller account contained in my official report to the American Commission to Negotiate Peace, which is printed in full in the appendix, does not adequately portray the sad conditions of these Jews in Poland at present. Giving harrowing details will not remedy the situation and might be misconstrued and do harm to those suffering people. Hence, I have abstained. It was in Vilna that we had a real showdown with the Chief of State of Poland. All this time we had been in the unpleasant position of a delegation of foreigners endeavoring to render service to a country whose president openly resented our presence there.
Pogroms.
Pilsudski had thundered when I first called on him. It was in the Tsar's summer palace near Warsaw that he was living, and he received me in the
Library,
where there was not a book to be seen.
There have been no pogroms in Poland. Nothing but unavoidable accidents.
I asked the difference.
A pogrom
He explained reluctantly.
Is a massacre ordered by the government or not prevented by it when prevention is possible. Among us no wholesale killings of Jews have been permitted. Our trouble isn't religious, it is economic. Our petty dealers are Jews. Many of them have been war profiteers, some have had dealings with the Germans or the Bolsheviki, or both, and this has created a prejudice against Jews in general.
At that meeting he stormed against the new school regulations. They would not only ghettoize the Jews, but, and here his real objection revealed itself, they were repugnant because forced upon the country from the outside.
Russia,
He declared,
will return to autocracy. The Russians can survive even the privations of Bolshevism.
but our problem is vastly different. We have become a free republic, and we propose to remain one, in spite of interference. The Poles and the Jews can't live together on friendly terms for years to come, but they will manage it at last. In the meantime, the Jew will have all his legal rights. It is our own affair, our own honor is involved, and we are entirely able to guard it.
now our commission was at Vilna and Pilsudski came there. It was his birthplace, and here were we invading it with an American commission. Etiquette required that Jadwi and I should call on him. The president was quartered in the bishop's palace. We were received with great formality and ushered through several vast rooms before we reached the audience chamber. A storm was brewing, a light was dim. We found ourselves in a great big uninviting room, with long windows opening on a large court. War had stripped it of all its ancient hangings. The old furniture that belonged there must have vanished. In its stead were a few pieces of cheap and stiff modern manufacture. There was a desk at the far end, and at it was seated Pilsudski. He was a huge, forbidding man. His uniform, buttoned tight to the base of his big neck, was unadorned by any orders, the uniform of a fighter. His square jaw was thrust out below, thick lips firmly set. His face was abnormally broad, with cheekbones high and prominent. His cropped hair bristled, and his snapping eyes glinted from under a thicket caused by his heavy eyebrows that met across his forehead. He had evidently been reading the anti-Semitic newspapers to advantage and was determined to give me a piece of his mind. The storm from heaven broke just as the verbal torrent began, and the patter of the rain on the stones of the old courtyard wove in and out like an orchestral obbligato to the Wagnerian recitative of the Polish chief of state. He spoke in German, a language excellently suited to his purpose, and soon the ancient rafters were ringing with his invective. He declared that he was the chosen head of 20 million people and would defend their dignity. He represented the Polish government, the ruling power of a people that had been a nation when America was unknown, and here was a committee of Americans stepping between the elected government of Poland and the Polish electors, positively belittling the former to the latter. He dismissed as unfounded the stories about bad treatment of prisoners. He asserted that, considering Vilna's population of 150,000, civilian casualties in the 3 days fighting for its occupation had been comparatively few. Excesses. The exaggerations of the foreign press concerning what had happened to a relatively small number of Jews had been monstrous. One would think the country drenched with blood, whereas the occurrences had been mere trifles inevitably incident to any conquest.
These little mishaps
He said,
were all over, and now you come here to stir the whole thing up again and probably make a report that may still further hurt our credit abroad.
The Polish people resent even the charge of ever having deserved distrust. How then can your activities have any other effect than to increase the racial antipathy that you say you want to end?
He was most bitter when he referred to Article 93.
Why not trust to Poland's honor?
he shouted.
Don't plead that the article's concessions are few in number or negative in character.
Let them be as small or as negative as you please. That article creates in authority a power to which to appeal outside the laws of this country. Every faction within Poland was agreed on doing justice to the Jew, and yet the peace conference, at the insistence of America, insults us by telling us that we must do justice. That was a public insult to my country, just as she was assuming her rightful place among the sovereign states of the world.
For fully 10 minutes he continued his tirade. Nothing could have stopped him, and I didn't try. When he was quite out of breath, I said quietly,
Well, General, you've made good use of your opportunity. You've gotten rid of all your gall.
Now let's talk from heart to heart.
I suited the expression of my face to my words. The effect was surprising. He stared at me for a moment with unbelieving eyes and then threw back his head and burst into a giant laugh. Then came my turn. I said that, in my official capacity, I was no Jew, was not even an American, but a representative of all civilized nations and their religions. I stood for tolerance in its broadest sense. I explained exactly what our commission was after, told what we had done so far, and made it clear that we were there not to injure Poland, but to help her. Pilsudski's entire attitude changed. Before I left him, he consented to release the Jewish prisoners still in custody since April 1919.
As rapidly as each case can be investigated.
On our return to Warsaw, Belinsky, the Minister of Finance, told us that, in order to get the Orthodox Jews' point of view, we should interview a wonder rabbiner. Inquiry convinced me that the outstanding of these, exercising a vast influence, was Rabbi Alter of Gorokalevaria, and unannounced Jadwin and I visited him at a summer resort near Warsaw. A large number of students surrounded him, all gowned in their long black kaftans and bearded in the extreme manner of their sect. He presented us to them and to his wife, and I found him anti-Zionistic and anti-nationalistic, but much depressed because of the harsh treatment of the Jews. I asked him to visit me in Warsaw. He came, accompanied by his son-in-law and 2 other Orthodox rabbis, Lewin and Sierkes, and I had a stenographer take down our conversation. Space will not permit the reproduction here of all that these leaders said, and I shall confine myself to repeating just a few of their remarks, and in considering them it should be kept in mind that the Orthodox Jews number 80% of the Jewish population of Poland.
A principal conflict,
Said Rabbi Alter,
is with Jews. Our chief opponents at every step are the Zionists. The Orthodox are satisfied to live side by side with people of different religions. The Zionists sidetrack religion. We are exiled.
Said Rabbi Lewin.
We cannot be freed from our banishment, nor do we wish to be. We cannot redeem ourselves. We will abide by our religion until God Almighty frees us.
And again,
we would rather be beaten and suffer for our religion. The Orthodox love Palestine far more than others, but they want it as a holy land for a holy race.
News of our proceedings had preceded us to Warsaw, and our purpose was beginning to be understood and appreciated even by those who had formerly suspected and mistrusted us. I had another talk there with Pilsudski. He said that the Poles and Jews must live together, that their relations could never be perfect, but that the government would really do its best to avoid friction. Meantime, he hoped that there would be an end of official missions to inquire into the problem. He had no objection to private investigations, and, so far as our mission was concerned, he admitted it had already had a good effect. He hoped our report would satisfy the world enough to end such inquiries, for he did feel that interference from foreign nations was bad for the prestige of the government at home. He concluded by asking Jadwin and myself to meet his cabinet at a luncheon which he had instructed S.K. Arzinski to arrange. S.K. Arzinski opened the talk that followed the luncheon by praising our work and our evident inclination to spare Poland's pride. I followed by saying that, though we would have to rap Poland's knuckles and blame some of the Poles severely for certain excesses and economic persecutions, which I strongly condemned, we would present our conclusions with fairness to both sides. It was important not to forget that this was a matter in which all the world was interested and that only strict honesty would satisfy. The Polish authorities had adopted a contradictory defense, entering a general denial and yet pleading justification. They ought to have confessed that excesses had occurred, denied any official participation in them, frowned upon them, and promised to prevent them in the future and punish the culprits. Belensky replied for the cabinet. A man of more than 70, he had held the portfolio of finance under the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria and was typical of the old continental bureaucracy. He, too, felicitated us on the pleasant ending of our work, concerning which, he said, he and his colleagues had entertained such grave doubts. Poland, he said, wanted no more
polemics.
The desire of the government was to quiet things. Any admission of mistakes, they thought, had better be decided by Paderewski. He hoped that our report would call attention to Poland's 1,000 years of culture, which had made her the advanced post of civilization in Eastern Europe, would mention that she had ever been tolerant toward the Jew and welcomed his arrival, and that she did not forget how, in the revolution of 1863, the Jews had loyally fought against Russia. They would not have done that, he argued, had the Poles been persecuting them. He said it was unfortunate that, in the recent war, some Jews had informed against the Poles in Galicia and thereby created the prejudice against them.
The Pole,
he concluded, must live side by side with the Jew and wants to do it in peace.
What in this question of anti-Semitism were the feelings of that member of the government who is best known to all the world? Ignace Paderewski is not only not an anti-Semite, he is infinitely the greatest of the modern Poles. After my experience at the synagogue in Warsaw, to which I have already referred, I asked Paderewski if he would not accompany me to service some Friday. I said that he was charged with being anti-Semitic.
how ridiculous.
He answered.
Paderewski.
I explained.
I know you are not anti-Semitic, and you know that you're not, but how are the people to be convinced of it?
Paderewski at once saw a point. He was anxious to refute the charge against him, yet his caution prompted him to consult his political associates, who advised against his adoption of my suggestion.
Never mind.
He reassured me.
I'll find another way.
That way he found when Hoover came to Warsaw. I was then about to visit Pinsk, and he requested me to postpone it for a day or two.
I am giving a state dinner for Mr. Hoover at my official residence,
said he.
I want you to come to that and let the doubters see how you will be one of the Premier's most honoured guests.
That dinner was a gorgeous affair. Everybody of political, financial, and social importance was there, the representatives of the old aristocracy, the makers of the new republic. The table was a sort of squared horseshoe, its head the outside centre of the crosspiece, its foot the inside centre. Paderewski had personally arranged the seating. On his right sat Gibson, at his left Jadwin and Mummy. Paderewski was at the table's head, Hoover sat at her left, General Pilsudski, as Chief of State, sat at her right, and at his right was the place that the Premier had given me. Few knew at that time of any change in General Pilsudski's attitude toward the Commission. All the guests opposed him, still firm in his opposition to us. From my seat beside him, I saw many inquisitive eyes fixed on us and showing their surprise at my sitting next to him. We were conversing intimately and almost incessantly. It was evident that everybody was wondering what passed between us. And what did? The terrible Chief of State was telling me, quite simply, the story of his adventurous life, how he had fought always for Polish liberty, how he had suffered imprisonment at Magdeburg.
But even when there seemed no hope for either my country or me,
he declared,
I never lost my faith. A marvelous gypsy palmist had assured me that I was destined to be dictator of Poland.
I looked at him in amazement. It seemed incredible that this hardened soldier should be speaking seriously.
The palmist,
he continued with the simplicity of a child,
found that the lines at the base of my right forefinger formed a star. That is a sure sign that the lucky bearer is to rise to mastery.
He held out his hand to me. I could almost hear the rustle of excitement among the watching guests, to whom, of course, his words were inaudible. The star was there. Then, inquisitively, I looked at my own right hand, and to my great surprise I also found a star.
I have the mark as well as you,
I laughingly proclaimed.
But the nearest approach I ever made to a dictatorship was when the British were expected in Constantinople in 1915, and I was to be in control of the city between the departure of the Turks and the British occupation.
News of what Pilsudski and I were doing spread rapidly. Many guests unsuccessfully looked for a star in their own hands and then came up to look at the generals and mine. Shoulder to shoulder with me sat this man trained to fighting. Opposite to him was Paderewski with his wonderful head, with its fine, high brow, from which flowed that magnificent shock of hair, and showing those piercing eyes whose expression had puzzled so many, and whose whole education had been directed toward the evoking of harmony. For years, American music lovers had listened to this great virtuoso and been entranced by his vigorous and yet delicate interpretation of many of the most difficult and intricate classics. Now, he was no longer living amid clouds of harmonies and etudes, but was second only to Pilsudski in the council of this budding republic. There sat this sheer genius, this unstarred master. He needed no mark on his palm, no divining gypsy prophecy to prove that he would excel in any sphere to which he might direct his talent. 12 or 15 years ago, there was a picture painted of him and hung in the Lemberg gallery. It showed him as Orpheus quieting the wild beasts with his lyre. It was of this that he irresistibly reminded me that night. He had undertaken the almost impossible task of reconciling the contending factions of his native land and was eliminating race hatred itself. From a chance post of vantage, I could not help watching the court he held during the reception that followed the dinner. It equaled that of Pilsudski. Princes and politicians vied with each other for an opportunity to approach him, and to each he gave, with a perfect grace, an absorbed attention. Another of his many sides I came to know. Poland's financial plight seemed to me, the more I studied it, not so desperate as feared. If prompt and decisive help were offered, I believed, the Poles would rally and work out their own salvation. As it was, the idle people were losing their self-respect and were drifting toward militarism simply through their inactivity. I thought a plan could be devised by which they could be aroused from their lethargy and given a start toward becoming a vigorous, self-supporting people. I had great faith in Paderewski, who, I felt, did not subscribe to the militaristic views of Pilsudski, and I thought there was a good chance for working out a plan for the economic salvation of his country. In Vilna I spoke to a number of prominent businessmen, irrespective of religion, in regard to this matter. I asked them whether, if America would help to organize a great corporation which would endeavor to finance Poland, they would be ready to subscribe to some of this stock. I was somewhat surprised at their prompt acquiescence.
But
I pointed out,
you'll probably be expected to subscribe in gold. Have you got it?
Oh yes.
they answered. Gold ravished Poland.
Where?
I asked.
In the Agrarian Bank.
I said that I didn't know the institution. Then they smilingly explained. The Agrarian Bank was a hole in the ground. At the outbreak of the World War, these thrifty Poles had buried their gold, hence these men of Vilna were ready to subscribe generously. When I returned to Warsaw, I discussed this plan with my associate Johnson, who had had business experience, and he became enthusiastic about it. I then presented it in detail to Paderewski, and his only criticism was that the Poles would want a majority of the stock at once. I told him that there was not the slightest objection to that, but that I could devise a method by which they could eventually secure all of it, and I doubted if it were wise to take too much at first. He then said that there must be an American at the head of this corporation, and that he must be one that was not connected with Wall Street, but who would have the confidence of the entire American community. I proposed several names, and we finally agreed that Franklin K. Lane was the best man. Paderewski asked me to put the full details of this plan in a letter to him. I asked Colonel Bryant, who was an expert stenographer, whether he would be willing to forget his military rank for a short time and revert to his former activities by acting as my secretary. He readily assented, and to escape the constant interruptions at our headquarters, the automobile 5 miles outside of Warsaw, gave the chauffeur a package of cigarettes and told him to disappear, and there on the highway I dictated in an American automobile to an American colonel a letter which will be found in the appendix. I handed this letter to Paderewski and stressed my views that the mere announcement of such a corporation being contemplated would more than double the value of the mark at once. Paderewski thought for a minute and then said,
Mr. Morgenthau, that is absolutely true, and I am afraid that that is going to prevent our adopting the scheme.
I was extremely puzzled and was dumbfounded as he continued.
We cannot afford to have our marks rise too rapidly. We have sold too many at this low price, and it would bankrupt us to redeem them at the higher value which this scheme would give them.
We must find some way of disregarding the present value of the mark and start a new currency system.
He had evidently given this some thought, because he asked me how long it would take in America to prepare new plates and print for them a new currency, and he told me that they would have piastres and pounds. I said I thought one of the banknote companies could do it in 3 months, perhaps less. Finally, he said to me,
Don't speak to anyone about this plan, because I don't want anyone to know that the suggestion comes from you until it is put into effect.
2 days later, when I met him again, he pulled out my letter and said,
Here I am carrying your letter, and am still giving attention to your scheme.
I still think that a cooperation of that kind would have put Poland on her feet. The time now approached for our commission's departure. Our investigations were ended, our work was done. We considered our final decision. There was no question whatever but that the Jews had suffered. There had been shocking outrages of at least a sporadic character resulting in many deaths and still more woundings and robberies, and there was a general disposition, not to say plot, of long standing, the purpose of which was to make the Jews uncomfortable in many ways. There was a deliberate conspiracy to boycott them economically and socially. Yet there was also no question but that some of the Jewish leaders had exaggerated these evils. There, too, were malevolent, self-seeking mischief-makers both in the Jewish and Polish press and among the politicians of every stripe. Jews and non-Jews alike started out with the presumption that there could be no reconciliation. Our commission had to deal with people, most of whom could not conceive of the possibility of disinterested regard for their welfare. Their experiences with the Russian courts had taught them always to overstate the facts, and when one realizes that there is a conflict of testimony and in most of them perjury is committed, it made us quite patient when we found them just a little less truthful than our American litigants. We found that, among the Jews, there was a thoughtful, ambitious minority who, sincere in their original motives, intensified the trouble by believing that its solution lay only in official recognition of the Jew as a separate nationality. They had seized on Zionism as a means to establish the Jewish nation. To them, Zionism was national, not religious. When questioned, they admitted that it was a name with which to capture the imagination of their brothers whose tradition bade them pray thrice daily for their return to the Holy Land. Pilsudski, in a moment of diplomatic aberration, had said that the Jews made a serious error in forcing Article 93. Quoting that utterance, these nationalists now asserted that neither the Polish government, nor the Romanian for that matter, ever would carry out the spirit of the treaty concessions, and so they aimed at nothing short of an autonomous government and a place in the family of nations. Meanwhile, they wanted to join the Polish nation in a federation having a joint parliament where both Yiddish and Polish should be spoken. Their favorite way of expressing it was to say that they wanted something like Switzerland where French, German, and Italian cantons worked together in harmony. Unfortunately, they disregarded the facts in the case. In Switzerland, generally speaking, the citizens of French language live in one section, those of German language in another, and so on, whereas these aspiring nationals, of course, wanted the Jews to continue scattered throughout Poland. They wanted this, and yet wanted them to have a percentage of representation in parliament equal to their percentage in the entire Polish nation. Finally, they took no account of the desires of the Orthodox Jews, who form about 80% of their number, who were content to remain in Poland and suffer for their religion if necessary, and whom the Polish politicians were already coddling and beginning to organize politically as a vote against the nationalist Zionists. The leaders of these nationalist Zionists were capable and adroit, but they were like walking delegates in the labor unions, who had to continue to agitate in order to maintain their leadership, and their advocacy of a state within a state was naturally resented by all. It was quite evident that one of the deep and obscure causes of the Jewish trouble in Poland was this nationalist Zionist leadership that exploited the Old Testament prophecies to capture converts to the nationalist scheme. Here, then, was Zionism in action. We had seen it at first hand in Poland. I returned home fearful that, owing to the extensive propaganda of the Zionists, the American people might obtain the erroneous impression that a vast majority of the Jews are not as it really was only a portion of the 150,000 Zionists in the United States had ceased considering Judaism as a religion and were in danger of conversion to nationalism. Chapter Roman 19. Zionism a surrender, not a solution. Zionism is the most stupendous fallacy in Jewish history. I assert that it is wrong in principle and impossible of realization, that it is unsound in its economics, fantastical in its politics, and sterile in its spiritual ideals. Where it is not pathetically visionary, it is a cruel playing with the hopes of a people blindly seeking their way out of age-long miseries. These are bold and sweeping assertions, but in this chapter one shall undertake to make them good. The very fervor of my feeling for the oppressed of every race in every land, especially for the Jews, those of my own blood and faith, to whom I am bound by every tender tie, impels me to fight with all the greater force against this scheme, which my intelligence tells me can only lead them deeper into the mire of the past, while it professes to be leading them to the heights. Zionism is a surrender, not a solution. It is a retrogression into the blackest era, and not progress toward the light. I will go further and say that it is a betrayal. It is an Eastern European proposal, fathered in this country by American Jews, which, if it were to succeed, would cost the Jews of America most that they have gained of liberty, equality, and fraternity. I claim to speak with knowledge on this subject. I have had occasion to know the Jew intimately in all the lands where he dwells in numbers, and to study his problems on his own ground with the intensity and sympathy which were required by my duty to help in each place to formulate the plans for his immediate assistance. I was born among the Jews of Germany, and by natural association with German Jews in New York, and by repeated visits to Germany, am familiar with their life and problems. As an American of 55 years' residence, as a director of the Educational Alliance and of Mt. Sinai Hospital, as president of the Bronx House and the Free Synagogue for more than 10 years, and as one who has traveled on speaking tours from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from Canada to New Orleans on behalf of the American Jewish Relief Committee, I became thoroughly familiar with the American Jews. As American ambassador to Turkey, I came into daily official contact with the Jews from all parts of the Near East, not only the Jews of Turkey and of the Turkish Protectorate in Palestine itself, but also the Jews of Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece, Romania and Bulgaria, to say nothing of the accredited representatives of the Zionist Party in Constantinople. As the head of President Wilson's commission, which was sent to investigate the alleged pogroms of the Jews of Poland following the armistice in 1919, I spent several months on the ground in Poland and Galicia, and talked with thousands of Jews in every walk of life in that greatest center of Jewish population in the world. They told me their troubles, the indignities and the perils they endured, the hatred of their neighbors because of their religion, the deliberate efforts that were being made to stifle their economic life, the political discriminations to which they were subjected, and the social barriers which did not permit them to enjoy a full life as members of their community. I speak as a Jew. I speak with fullest sympathy for the Jew everywhere. I have seen him in his poverty despised, hated, spat upon, beaten, murdered. My blood boils with his at the thought of the indignities and outrages to which he is subjected. I, too, would find for him, for me, the way out of this morass of poverty, hatred, political inequality, and social discrimination. But is Zionism that way? I assert emphatically that it is not. I deny it not merely from an intellectual recoil from the fallacy of its reasoning, but from my very experience of life, as a seeker after religious truth, as a practical businessman, as an active participant in politics, as one who has had experience in international affairs, and as a Jew who has at heart the best interests of his co-religionists. First, let me trace briefly the origins of Zionism. I shall not attempt to give a complete resume of these origins, but shall sketch only a broad picture of the facts. Zionism is based upon a literal acceptance of the promises made to the Jews by their prophets in the Old Testament, that Zion should be restored to them and that they should resume their once glorious place as a peculiar people, singled out by God for his special favor, exercising dominion over their neighbors in his name, and enjoying all the freedom and blessings of a race under the unique protection of the Almighty. Of course, the prophets meant these things symbolically and were dealing only with the spiritual life. They did not mean earthly power or materialistic blessings. But most Jews accepted them in the physical sense, and they fed upon this glowing dream of earthly grandeur as a relief from the sordid realities of the daily life which they were compelled to lead. Zionism arose out of the miseries of the Jews. It was offered as a remedy, a release, a plan of action which would provide a road to happiness. This is the secret of its hold upon its adherents. The promises which it offers are so dazzling that Jews everywhere have rushed to embrace its faith without stopping to examine them closely or to calculate whether they can be made good. Zionism is not a new idea, but it gained a fresh impetus following the outbreak of wholesale massacres in Russia, beginning with Kiev and Kishinev, and all through that ghastly trail of bloodshed following the recrudescence of antisemitism. The Jews, in their agony and peril, sought afresh for a path towards safety. Zionism was then restated as the remedy. Theodor Herzl gained new power as its fiery apostle, and Jews the world over embraced the doctrine as a drowning man grasps at a straw. This largely accounts for the present intense agitation of the Zionists. Let me now define Zionism more fully. To the average Jew, unread in other histories than his own, ignorant of the great currents of world progress in science, industry, and the art of government, it is a blind and simple faith in the imminence of realization of the dream I have just described of the re-erection of Zion as an earthly kingdom. By those intellectual leaders of Jewish thought who had embraced this fallacy of a panacea, Zionism is defined in more subtle and in more plausibly rational terms. There are, first, those intellectual Jews who conceive of
Zion,
that is, Jerusalem restored to the Jews as being a physical symbol of spiritual leadership, lifted up before their eyes and inspiring them all to a common purpose as a demonstration of Hebraic civilization, a center from which should proceed instruction and exhortation to the Jews of all the world. This analogy, however, is not complete. For these leaders conceive the Jews to be not merely a religious congregation, but, besides, a nation. They think that not merely should spiritual power be centralized in Zion, but temporal power as well. In their view, the discrimination against Jews in other countries will greatly diminish once there is erected a Jewish state in Palestine. This nation is to be, in their theory, not only the seat of a religion and the fostering home of distinctive racial culture. It is to be, as well, an actual political entity with territorial boundaries and a capital city, maintaining a temporal government with a ruler crediting ambassadors to foreign courts and capitals, dealing with other governments on an equality as a sovereign state, and seeking to use the familiar instruments of diplomatic pressure to redress the wrongs of its citizens who happen to reside under the jurisdiction of
foreign
nations. I say that this is the program of the Zionists, perhaps I should say worse. It is true that they have, for the moment, altered the structure of their dream to accept the compromise held out to them by the Balfour Declaration. They have stepped down from their plans for a sovereign Jewish state in Palestine. They now accept the ideal of a
national home for the Jewish people.
To quote the words of that declaration, this is, however, only a temporary compromise, a truce. Nothing short of the full glory of their Zion will long content the ambitious apostles of Zionism. It is worthwhile at this point to digress for a moment from my main argument, to point out that the Balfour Declaration is itself not even a compromise. It is a shrewd and adroit delusion. The Balfour Declaration is
His Majesty's government views would favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, nor the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
The plain sense of these plain words has been woefully misunderstood by some of the Zionist leaders and willfully distorted by others. They contain no promise of a Jewish state, they offer no recognition of a Jewish nation. They do, it is true, apply the obscure but pleasant name of
Jewish homeland
to the land which the Declaration then accurately defines by its political name as
Palestine.
But it guarantees to the Jews in their homeland only those familiar assurances of security of person and property which are the common possessions of British subjects the world over. I have been astonished to find that such an intelligent body of American Jews as the Central Conference of American Rabbis should have fallen into a grievous misunderstanding of the purport of the Balfour Declaration. In a resolution adopted by them, they assert that the Declaration says,
Palestine is to be a national homeland for the Jewish people.
"Not at all! The actual words of the declaration I quote from the official text are:
His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
These two phrases sound alike, but they are really very different. I can make this obvious by an analogy. When I first read the Balfour Declaration, I was making my home in the Plaza Hotel. Therefore I could say with truth,
My home is in the Plaza Hotel.
I could not say with truth,
The Plaza Hotel is my home.
if it were,
My home.
I would have the freedom of the whole premises and could occupy any room in the house with impunity. Quite obviously, however, I could not occupy the rooms of any other of the guests of the hotel whose leases long antedated mine. These men would gladly entertain me as a visitor, but how they would resent and legally fight so unjustifiable an attempt as my trying forcibly to enter their premises and displace them and make their quarters my home. This is exactly the differentiation in meaning between the Balfour Declaration and the claims of those Zionists who profess to see in it British authority for claiming Palestine as the seat of a Jewish nation. The Balfour Declaration very carefully says,
The British government favours the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine.
but this does not say that the Jews shall have the right to dispossess or to trespass upon the property of those far more numerous Arab tenants whose right to their share in it is as good as that of the Jews and, in most cases, of much longer standing. Palestine is a country already populated, and the British government has no intention of evicting the Arab owners of the soil in favour of the Jews. Nor, I may add in passing, have the Arab owners any intention of selling their holdings to the Jews, for they are fully aware of the Zionist program, are very resentful of it, and intend to use every means at their command to frustrate it. In February 1921, this obvious meaning of the Balfour Declaration was made officially explicit when the complete text of the mandate for Palestine was first made public. After reiterating in the preamble the language which I have above quoted, this official transaction of the Council of the League of Nations proceeds to enumerate the specific terms under which Palestine shall be governed as a mandatory of Great Britain. The very first article of this mandate explodes completely the theory that the Allied powers had any idea of setting up a Jewish nation. It reads,
His Britannic Majesty shall have the power to exercise as mandatories all the powers inherent in the government of a sovereign state save as they may be limited by the terms of the present mandate.
in other words, not a government of Jews over a Jewish nation, but His Britannic Majesty is declared to be the repository of
The powers inherent in a sovereign state.
To be sure, these powers are limited by certain specific terms enumerated in the mandate. Space does not permit a quotation of them in full, but I would advise those interested to secure a copy of the mandate and to study it in the light of the claim of some Zionists that the Balfour Declaration recognizes a Jewish state. These so-called
Limitations
do not really limit the sovereign power of His Britannic Majesty. They are not limitations, they are statements of the direction in which the British as mandatories pledge themselves to pay special attention to the interests of the Jews as a part of the body of the citizens of Palestine. Except for these expressions of benevolent intention specifically toward the Jews, every one of the 27 articles in the Declaration is just as applicable to every other citizen of Palestine, whether Jew or Gentile, Mohammedan, Arab, or Christian Syriac. They are guarantees of civil liberty, freedom of conscience, equality before the law, and the like. It was a politic move of the British government to name a Jew as the first governing head of Palestine when the British began to function under this mandate. But this appointment of Sir Herbert Samuel was only politic, it was not political. It has no general significance. As I have said, some of the Zionist leaders woefully misunderstood the Balfour Declaration. The terms of the mandate now leave to them no room for misunderstanding. Other Zionist leaders, however, willfully misrepresented it. They knew that it meant what it said, but they did not dare to tell their followers what it meant. They chose rather to let them think that it was only another phrasing of their original program of the erection of a Zionistic national sovereign state, or that it would lead to it. These misleaders, being more vociferous than their more honest colleagues, have had the ear of the great mass of Jews throughout the world. This mass now believes that Zionism as a national ideal is presently attainable, if, indeed, it is not actually attained already. These Zionistic apostles are culpable in that they have failed to undeceive the masses of this era. Instead, they have capitalized this credulous faith and are collecting funds in America and in Europe, ostensibly to finance what they call the establishment of their dream, although really, as I believe, to finance further propaganda for their unattainable ideal. Having disposed of the fallacious assumption that Zionism has been or is about to be attained, let me now return to my main argument, namely, that it never can be attained, and that it ought not to be attained. Let us examine the pretensions of Zionism from three essential angles. Is it an economic fallacy? Is it a political fantasy? Is it a spiritual will-o'-the-wisp? First, its economic aspect. I assert positively that it is impossible. Zionists have been working for 30 years with fanatical zeal and backed by millions of money from philanthropic Jews of great wealth in France, England, Germany, and America, and the total result of their operations at the outbreak of the World War was the movement of 10,000 Jews from other lands to the soil of Palestine. In the same period, 1.5 million Jews have migrated to America. The truth is that Palestine cannot support a large population in prosperity. It has a lean and niggard soil. It is a land of rocky hills, upon which, for many centuries, a hardy people have survived only with difficulty by cultivating a few patches of soil here and there, with the olive, the fig, citrus fruits, and the grape, or have barely sustained their flocks upon the sparse native vegetation. The streams are few and small, entirely insufficient for the great irrigation systems that would be necessary for the general cultivation of the land. The underground sources of water can be developed only at a prodigious capital expense. There are 13 million Jews in the world. The Zionist organization itself claims for Palestine only a maximum possible population of 5 million. Even this claim is on the face of it an extravagant overestimate. After careful study on the spot in Palestine, I prophesy that it will not support more than 1 million additional inhabitants. Palestine is in area about equal to the state of Massachusetts, and that New England state, blessed as Palestine is not with plentiful water, ample water powers, abundant forestation, and a good soil, supports only 4 million people. This bald comparison, however, does not begin to tell the story. Massachusetts is an integral part of a tremendously prosperous nation of 100 million souls, distributed among 48 states, between which there are no political boundaries to protect, no fences to be maintained, no tariff discrimination, or unfavorable exchanges to be considered. She enjoys all the advantages of a highly industrialized community and of established commercial intercourse with the rest of the most progressive nations in the world. If Massachusetts was situated as Palestine is situated, remote from the great currents of modern economic life, without even one of those absolutely indispensable prerequisites to commercial success, namely natural ports, without its network of railways bringing to it cheaply the raw materials for its manufactures and carrying from it cheaply and quickly to rich markets its manufactured articles, Massachusetts would support a population far less than its present numbers. This is a condition of Palestine. Not only must agriculture be pursued under the greatest possible handicaps of soil and water, but it is subject to the direct competition of far more favored lands in the very agricultural products for which it is distinctive. These are the citrus fruits, almonds, figs and dates, grapes and wine. How can little Palestine compete in these products with Italy, France, and Spain, and their North African colonies, whose richest soil lies in the direct line of the great march of commerce? A great industrial Palestine is equally unthinkable. It lacks the raw materials of coal and iron, it lacks the skill in technical processes and the experience in the arts, and, above all, it is not in the path of modern trade currents. What hope is there for Palestine as an industrial nation in competition with America, Great Britain, and Germany, with their prodigious resources, their highly organized factories, their great mass production, and their superb means of transportation? The notion is preposterous. I claim that the foregoing analysis demolishes the economic foundation of Zionism. What of its political foundations? Is Zionism a political fantasy? I assert most emphatically that it is. The present British mandate over Palestine is a recognition, by the great powers of the world, of the supreme political interest of Great Britain in that region. It was no mere accident that it was a British army which captured Jerusalem from the Turks in a late war. The life and death importance of the Suez Canal to the integrity of the British Empire has for more than half a century made the destiny of Palestine as well as of Egypt a vital concern of British statesmanship. So long as the Turk was in control, the British had no cause to fear what that impotent and backward neighbour might do to interrupt the life current that flows through this jugular vein connecting India with the British Isles. But now that the Turk is in process of being dispossessed of sovereignty, and the future disposition of his territories in doubt, British statesmen can hold but one opinion concerning either Egypt or Palestine, and this opinion is that no matter what else may befall, British influence must be omnipotent on both sides of the Suez Canal. It may be politic for them for the moment to coddle the aspirations of a numerically negligible race like the Jews. But the notion that Great Britain would for one instant allow any form of government in Palestine, under any name whatever, that was not in fact an appanage of the British Crown and subservient to the paramount interests of British world policy is too fantastical for serious refutation. I have just said that it may be politic for the British government to coddle the aspirations of the Jews. There are, however, profound reasons why this coddling will not take the form of granting to them even the name and surface appearance of a sovereign government ruling Palestine. In the first place, Britain's hold upon India is by no means so secure that the imperial government at London can afford to trifle with the fanatical sensibilities of the millions of Mohammedans in its Indian possessions. Remember that Palestine is as much the holy land of the Mohammedan as it is the holy land of the Jew, or the holy land of the Christian. His shrines cluster there as thickly. They are to him as sacredly endeared. In 1914 I visited the famous caves of Machpelah, 20 miles from Jerusalem, and I shall never forget the mutterings of discontent that murmured in my ears, nor the threatening looks that confronted my eyes, from the lips and faces of the devout Mohammedans whom I there encountered. For these authentic tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are as sacred to them because they are saints of Islam as they are to the most orthodox of my fellow Jews, whose direct ancestors they are not only in the spiritual but in the actual physical sense. To these Mohammedans, my presence at the tombs of my ancestors was as much a profanation of a Mohammedan holy place as if I had laid sacrilegious hands upon the sacred relics in the mosque at Mecca. To imagine that the British government will sanction a scheme for a political control of Palestine which would place in the hands of the Jews the physical guardianship of these shrines of Islam is to imagine something very foreign to the practical political sense of the most politically practical race on earth. They know too well how deeply they would offend their myriad Mohammedan subjects to the east. Exactly the same political issue of religious fanaticism applies to the question of Christian sensibilities. Anyone who has seen, as in 1914 I saw at Eastertide, the tens of thousands of devout Roman Catholics from Poland, Italy, and Spain, and the other tens of thousands of devout Greek Catholics from Russia and the East, who yearly frequent the shrines of Christianity in Palestine, and who thus consummate a lifetime of devotion by a pilgrimage undertaken at to them staggering expense and physical privation, and who has observed, as I have observed, the suppressed hatred of them all for both the Jew and the Mussulman, and who has noted, further, the bitter jealousies between even Protestant and Catholic, between Greek Catholic and Roman. Such an observer, I say, can entertain no illusions that the placing of these sacred shrines of Christian tradition in the hands of the Jews would be tolerated. The most enlightened Christians might endure it, but the great mass of Christian worshippers of Europe would not. They regard the Jew not merely as a member of a rival faith, but the man whose ancestors rejected their fellow Jew, the Christ, and crucified him. Their fanaticism is a political fact of gigantic proportions. A Jewish state in Palestine would inevitably arouse their passion. Instead of such a state adding new dignity and consideration to the position of the Jew the world over as the Zionists claim it would do, I am convinced that it would concentrate, multiply, and give new venom to the hatred which he already endures in Poland and Russia, the very lands in which most of the Jews now dwell and where their oppressions are the worst. The political pretensions of Zionism are fantastic. I think the foregoing paragraphs have demonstrated this. Is Zionism a spiritual will-o'-the-wisp? I assert with all the vigor of my most profound convictions that it is. Its professed spiritual aim is the reassertion of the dignity and worth of the Jew. It is a mechanism designed to restore to him his self-respect and to secure for him the respect of others. The means by which it proposes to accomplish this have been described above. How pitifully inadequate these means are has been demonstrated. The effort of the Jews to attain their legitimate spiritual ambitions by means of a political mechanism need hardly further to be controverted in a negative or destructive sense. I prefer to meet this issue on positive and constructive grounds. My answer to the spiritual pretensions of Zionism is the positive answer that the solution has already been discovered, the way out has been found. The courageous Jew, the intellectually honest Jew, the forward-looking Jew, the Jew who has been willing to fight for his rights on the spot where they were infringed, has won his battle and has found all the glorious freedom which Zionism so impractically describes. The brave Jews of England did not surrender their cause. They did not seek a moral opiate in an oriental pipe dream of retreat to a cloudland Zion pictured by fancy on the arid hills of Palestine. They stayed in England, they fought on English soil for their rights as men. Their courage enlisted the admiration of the noblest spirits among the English, and it allied to them such Britons as Macaulay and George Bentinck, whose splendid eloquence and political acumen assisted in the repeal of the Jewish disabilities in 1850. This epochal legislation gave the Jews every right enjoyed in Britain by the Christians. It made possible the splendid political career of Beaconsfield, for many years Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the brilliant experience of Sir Rufus Isaacs, now Earl Reading, who has progressed through the highest political honours of the nation as Lord Chief Justice, Ambassador to America, and Viceroy of India. Do not forget that in this victorious struggle the Jew made no compromise whatever with his conscience. He did not abandon his racial, religious, or cultural heritage. The courageous and wise Jews of France and Italy have fought the same battle to the same victorious conclusion. But this book will be read chiefly by Americans. Such influence as it may wield will be particularly upon American minds. Need I elaborate the argument in its American setting? The facts lie upon the surface for the dullest eyes to see them. Nowhere in the world has so glorious an opportunity been offered to the Jew. Generous America has thrown wide the doors of opportunity to him. The Jew possesses no talents of the mind or spirit that cannot find here a free field for their most complete expression. Does he seek political office? Jews in this country have been or are members of every legislature, including the Senate of the United States, ambassadors representing the person of the President at foreign courts, officers of the judiciary in every grade from Justice of the Peace to Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Does he seek freedom of conscience? He may freely choose his mode of worship, from the strictest of orthodox tabernacles to the most liberal of free synagogues. Does he seek a field for business talent? The evidence of opportunity in this direction is so overwhelming that it need not here be wearyingly recapitulated. The progress of Adolph S. Ox from a printer's devil in Knoxville, 10-50 years ago, to owner of the greatest newspaper in the greatest city in the world, is characteristic of dozens of like successful Jewish careers in this country, and it is emblematic of hundreds of thousands of Jewish careers less spectacular but equally momentous in their own degree. Does he seek social position? Here, indeed, his path is made more difficult. But the social barriers are not insurmountable. Where they seem so, calm judgment will reveal that the social environment where this irrational prejudice exists is not worthy of the entrance of the Jew. Leave the intolerant to associate with their own kind. The Jew who has raised himself to the highest level will have put himself beyond the reach of prejudice, and he will find himself welcomed in the highest Christian circles. The enlightened Jews of America have found the true road to Zion. To them Zion is no mere political mechanism existing by the political sufferance of the greater powers. It is not defined by geographical boundaries circumscribing an arid plot of ground which their ancestors of 2,000 years ago conquered from its aboriginal inhabitants and occupied for a brief, though glorious, period before they, in turn, were driven onward by a new conqueror. To them Zion is a region of the soul. To them it is an inner light set upon the hill of personal consciousness, inspiring them as individuals to fight each for himself the battle of life where he meets it, demanding in virtue of his own worth the respect of those about him, winning through to the dignity and position to which his native gifts and his self-developed character entitle him. This is the only true Zion. All other definitions of it are unreal. The proudest boast of all these men, and my proudest boast, is,
I am an American.
None of us would deny our race or faith. We are Jews by blood. We are Jews, though of various sects, by religion. But as for me, and here I am sure I speak for a vast body of Jews in the United States, if I were pressed to define myself by any single appellation, I would unhesitatingly select the one word American. Neither I nor the humblest worshipper in the most orthodox congregation can hope for anything from Zionism that is not already ours in virtue of our participation in the freedom of America. And neither of us need make the smallest compromise with any conviction that we hold dear. I have found it more convenient, as well as quite within the approval of what I regard as my somewhat more enlightened conscience, to cast off the other symbols of the Hebraic faith, such as the kosher observancies, the untouched beard, and the distinctive dress. There are thousands of Russian Jews in the United States today who retain these excrescences of antiquity, with only a small inconvenience that is certainly very far short of persecution. From observation and experience I know full well that these same orthodox devotees will themselves become enlightened. If not they, then certainly their children, and will perceive, as I and others have perceived, that the Mosaic admonitions were purely temporal devices, expedient truly for the age in which they were promulgated, useful until modern sanitation and modern education did their work, but now become empty of those first values. Here lies the crux of my affirmative argument against Zionism. We anti-Zionist Jews of America found that the spiritual life, after whatever formula of faith, in modern times can be most fully enjoyed by those people who accept the beneficent progress which the world at large has made in science, industry, and the art of government. We have learned the folly of persisting in the sanitary regulations taught by Moses in this age, when all civilized peoples have the benefit of the more advanced sanitary knowledge of Lister, Pasteur, Metchnikoff, and Flexner. We have learned the folly of persisting in a distinctive style of clothing, beard, and locks imposed upon the Jews extraneously as a badge of slavery and oppression, and of ascribing a spiritual significance to such a costume in this age, when saints like Montefiore and Baron Edmund de Rascalde, the great patrons of Palestine, have found sanctity not incompatible with the ordinary dress of those about them. We have come to see that the worship of the God of Israel, the acceptable obedience to his will, is not contingent upon the clothes one wears, upon the meat one eats. His kingdom is the soul of man. In that boundless temple he receives the priceless sacrifices of the true believer. That time and place and mode are most acceptable to him in which the human spirit brings its richest offerings. It follows, then, that the Jew everywhere in Poland and Russia, as well as in France and America, can acceptably serve the God of his fathers and still enter fully into the life about him. We in America refuse to set ourselves apart in a voluntary ghetto for the sake of old traditional observances. I have often used a figure of speech. It was brought to my mind by meeting the rug makers in Turkey as follows: the Jew has been content, in most lands and dandy ages, to be the fringe of the carpet, a loose end over which every foot has stumbled, where every heel has left its injuring impression on the disconnected individual strands. What the Jew should do is to become a part of the pattern of the carpet itself, weave himself into the very warp and woof of the main fabric of humanity, and gain the strength which comes from a coordinated and orderly relation to the other strands of human society. His peculiar beauties, his peculiar talents, which in the fringe are soiled and hidden, take on new value when they become part of the main carpet, and they find their glory in lending to the pattern a unique splendor and a special luster. I, for one, will not forego this vision of the destiny of the Jews. I do not presume to say to my co-religionists of Europe that they shall accept my program, but neither do I intend to allow them to impose their program upon me. They may continue, if they will, a practice of our common faith which invites martyrdom, and which makes the continuance of oppression a certainty. I have found a better way, and when I say I, it is to speak collectively as one of the great body of American Jews of like mind. In the foregoing pages I have given my reasons for opposing Zionism. They make plain why I asserted at the beginning of this chapter that Zionism is not a solution, but it is a surrender. It looks backward and not forward. It would practically place in the hands of a few men, steeped in a foreign tradition, the power to turn back the hands of time upon all which I and my predecessors of the same convictions have won for ourselves here in America. We have fought our way through to liberty, equality, and fraternity. We have found a rest for our souls. No one shall rob us of these gains. We enjoy in America exactly the spiritual liberty, the financial success, and the social position which we have earned. Any Jew in America who wishes to be a saint of Zion has only to practice the cultivation of his spiritual gifts. There is none to hinder him. A Jew in America who seeks material reward has only to cultivate the powers of his mind and character. There are no barriers between him and achievement. Any Jew in America who yearns for social position has only to cultivate his manners. There are no insurmountable discriminations here against true gentlemen. The Jews of France have found France to be their Zion. The Jews of England have found England to be their Zion. We Jews of America have found America to be our Zion. Therefore I refuse to allow myself to be called a Zionist. I am an American. Appendix. Report of the mission of the United States to Poland. American Commission to negotiate peace. Mission to Poland. Paris, October 3, 1919. To the American Commission to negotiate peace. Gentlemen, 1. A mission consisting of Mr. Henry Morgenthau, Brig. Gen. Edgar Jadwin, and Mr. Homer H. Johnson was appointed by the American Commission to negotiate peace to investigate Jewish matters in Poland. The appointment of such a mission had previously been requested by Mr. Paderewski, President of the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Poland. On June 30, 1919, Secretary Lansing wrote to this mission. It is desired that the mission make careful inquiry into all matters affecting the relations between the Jewish and non-Jewish elements in Poland. This will, of course, involve the investigation of the various massacres, pogroms, and other excesses alleged to have taken place, the economic boycott, and other methods of discrimination against the Jewish race. The establishment of the truth in regard to these matters is not, however, an end in itself. It is merely for the purpose of seeking to discover the reason lying behind such excesses and discriminations with a view to finding a possible remedy. The American government, as you know, is inspired by a friendly desire to render service to all elements in the New Poland, Christians and Jews alike. I am convinced that any measures that may be taken to ameliorate the conditions of the Jews will also benefit the rest of the population, and that, conversely, anything done for the community benefit of Poland as a whole will be of advantage to the Jewish race. I am sure that the members of your mission are approaching the subject in the right spirit, free from prejudice one way or the other, and filled with the desire to discover the truth and involve some constructive measures to improve the situation, which gives concern to all the friends of Poland. 2. The mission reached Warsaw on July 13, 1919, and remained in Poland until September 13, 1919. All the places where the principal excesses had occurred were visited. In addition thereto, the mission also studied the economic and social conditions in such places as Lodz, Krakow, Grodno, Kalisz, Posen, Kom, Lublin, and Stanislaw. But automobiling over 2,500 miles through Russian, Austrian, and German Poland, the mission also came into immediate contact with the inhabitants of the small towns and villages. In order properly to appreciate the present cultural and social conditions, the mission also visited educational institutions, libraries, hospitals, museums, art galleries, orphan asylums, and prisons. 3. Investigations of the excesses were made mostly in the presence of representatives of the Polish government and the Jewish communities. There were also present in many cases military and civil officials and, wherever possible, officials in command at the time the excesses occurred were conferred with and interrogated. In this work the Polish authorities and the American minister to Poland, Mr. Hughes Gibson, lent the mission every facility. Deputations of all kinds of organizations were received and interviewed. A large number of public meetings and gatherings were attended, and the mission endeavored to obtain a correct impression of what had occurred, of the present mental state of the public, and of the attitude of the various factions toward one another. 4. The Jews first entered Poland in large numbers during the 12th and 13th centuries, when they migrated from Germany and other countries as the result of severe persecutions. Their language was German, which subsequently developed into a Hebrew-German dialect, or Yiddish. As prior to this immigration only two classes or estates had existed in Poland, the owners and the tillers of the soil. The Jewish immigrant became the pioneer of trade and finance, settling in the towns and villages. As time went on, it became generally known throughout Europe that Poland was a place of refuge for the Jews, and their numbers were augmented as a result of persecutions in Western Europe. Still more recently, as a result of the expulsion of the Jews from Russia on account of the enforcement of the Power of Settlement and of the May laws of 1882, their number was further increased. 5. Notwithstanding the fact that Poland has been a place of refuge for the Jews, there have been anti-Jewish movements at various times. The present anti-Semitic feeling took a definite political form after the Russian Revolution of 1905. This feeling reached an intense stage in 1912, when the Polish National Democratic Party nominated an anti-Semite to represent Warsaw in the Russian Duma, and the Jews cast their vote for a Polish socialist and carried the election. The National Democratic Party then commenced a vigorous anti-Semitic campaign. During the German occupation, this campaign was temporarily reduced. At the end of the Great War, the chaotic and unnatural state of affairs in which Poland found itself gave good ground for a condition of social unrest, which, together with the world-stimulated tendency toward national self-determination, accentuated the feeling between Jewish and non-Jewish elements. The chauvinistic reaction created by the sudden acquisition of a long-coveted freedom ripened the public mind for anti-Semitic or anti-alien sentiment, which was strongly agitated by the press and by politicians. This finally encouraged physical manifestations of violent outcroppings of an unbalanced social condition. 6. When, in November 1918, the Austrian and German armies of occupation left Poland, there was no firm government until the arrival of Gen. Pilsudski, who had escaped from a German prison, and it was during this period, before the Polish Republic came into being, that the first of the excesses took place. The mission has purposely avoided the use of the word
pogrom,
as the word is applied to everything from petty outrages to premeditated and carefully organized massacres. No fixed definition is generally understood. There were 8 principal excesses, which are here described in chronological order. 1. Kielce, November 11, 1918. Shortly after the evacuation of the Austrian troops from Kielce, the Jews of this city secured permission from the local authorities to hold a meeting in the Polski Theatre. The purpose of this meeting was to discuss Jewish national aspirations. It began shortly before 2 o'clock and filled the theatre to overflowing. During the afternoon, a small crowd of Polish civilians, largely composed of students, gathered outside of the theatre. At 6:30 p.m. the meeting began to break up, and when only about 300 people remained in the theatre, some militiamen entered and began to search for arms. A short while thereafter, and while the militiamen were still in the building, a crowd of civilians and some soldiers came into the auditorium and drove the Jews toward the stairs. On the stairs there was a double line of men armed with clubs and bayonets who beat the Jews as they left the building. After the Jews reached the street, they were again beaten by a mob outside. As a result of this attack, 4 Jews were killed and a large number wounded. A number of civilians have been indicted for participation in this excess, but have not as yet been brought to trial. 2 Lemberg, November 21-23, 1918. On October 30, 1918, when the Austrian Empire collapsed, the Ukrainian troops, formerly in the Austrian service, assumed control of the town. A few hundred Polish boys, combined with numerous volunteers of doubtful character, recaptured about half the city and held it until the arrival of Polish reinforcements on November 21. The Jewish population declared themselves neutral, but the fact that the Jewish quarter lay within the section occupied by the Ukrainians, and that the Jews had organized their own militia, and further, the rumor that some of the Jewish population had fired upon the soldiery, stimulated amongst the Polish volunteers an anti-Semitic bias that readily communicated itself to the relieving troops. The situation was further complicated by the presence of some 15,000 uniformed deserters and numerous criminals released by the Ukrainians from local jails, who were ready to join in any disorder, particularly if, as in the case of wholesale pillage, they might profit thereby. Upon the final departure of the Ukrainians, these disreputable elements plundered to the extent of many millions of crowns the dwellings and stores in the Jewish quarter, and did not hesitate at murder when they met with resistance. During the ensuing disorders, which prevailed on November 21, 22, and 23, 64 Jews were killed and a large amount of property destroyed. 38 houses were set on fire, and owing to the paralysis of the fire department, were completely gutted. The synagogue was also burned, and large numbers of the sacred scrolls of the law were destroyed. The repression of the disorders was rendered more difficult by the prevailing lack of discipline among the newly organized Polish troops and by a certain hesitation among the junior officers to apply stern punitive measures. When officers' patrols under experienced leaders were finally organized on November 23, robbery and violence ceased. As early as December 24, 1918, the Polish government, through the Ministry of Justice, began a strict investigation of the events of November 21 and 23. A special commission, headed by Justice of the Supreme Court, sat in Lemberg for about 2 months and rendered an extensive formal report which has been furnished this mission. In spite of the crowded docket of the local courts, where over 7,000 cases are now pending, 164 persons, 10 of them Jews, have been tried for complicity in the November disorders, and numerous similar cases await disposal. 44 persons are under sentences ranging from 10 days to 18 months. Aside from the civil courts, the local court-martial has sentenced military persons to confinement for as long as 3 years for lawlessness during the period in question. This mission is advised that on the basis of official investigations the government has begun the payment of claims for damages resulting from these events. 3 Pinsk, April 5, 1919. Late in the afternoon of April 5, 1919, a month or more after the Polish occupation of Pinsk, some 75 Jews of both sexes, with the official permission of the town commander, gathered in the assembly hall at the People's House in the Kupika Street to discuss the distribution of relief sent by the American Joint Distribution Committee. As the meeting was about to adjourn, it was interrupted by a band of soldiers, who arrested and searched the whole assembly and, after robbing the prisoners, marched them at a rapid pace to gendarmerie headquarters. Thence the prisoners were conducted to the marketplace and lined up against the wall of the cathedral. With no light except the lamps of a military automobile, the 6 women in the crowd, and about 25 men, were separated from the mass, and the remainder, 35 in number, were shot with scant deliberation and no trial whatever. Early the next morning 3 wounded victims were shot in cold blood when it was found that they were still alive. The women and other reprieved prisoners were confined in the city jail until the following Thursday. The women were stripped and beaten by the prison guards so severely that several of them were bedridden for weeks thereafter, and the men were subjected to similar maltreatment. It has been asserted officially by the Polish authorities that there was reason to suspect this assemblage of Bolshevist allegiance. This mission is convinced that no arguments of Bolshevist nature were mentioned in the meeting in question. While it is recognized that certain information of Bolshevist activities in Pinsk had been received by 2 Jewish soldiers, the undersigned is convinced that Maj. Luksinski, the town commander, showed reprehensible and frivolous readiness to place credence upon such untested assertions, and on this insufficient basis took inexcusably drastic action against reputable citizens whose loyal character could have been immediately established by consultation with any well-known non-Jewish inhabitant. The statements made officially by Gen. Listowski, the Polish group commander, that the Jewish population on April 5 attacked the Polish troops, are regarded by this mission as devoid of foundation. The undersigned is further of the opinion that the consultation prior to executing the 35 Jews, alleged by Maj. Luksinski to have had the character of a court-martial, was by the very nature of the case a most casual affair with no judicial nature whatever, since less than an hour elapsed between the arrest and the execution. It is further found that no conscientious effort was made at the time either to investigate the charges against the prisoners or even sufficiently to identify them. Though there have been official investigations of this case, none of the offenders answerable for this summary execution have been punished or even tried, nor has the Diet Commission published its findings. 4 Leader, April 17, 1919. On April 17, 1919, Polish military forces captured Leader from the Russian Bolsheviks. After the city fell into the hands of the Poles, the soldiers proceeded to enter and rob the houses of the Jews. During this period of pillage 39 Jews were killed. A large number of Jews, including the local rabbi, were arbitrarily arrested on the same day by the Polish authorities and kept for 24 hours without food amid revolting conditions of filth and no. 60 Kamienska Street. Jews were also impressed for forced labor without respect for age or infirmity. It does not appear that anyone has been punished for these excesses, or that any steps have been taken to reimburse the victims of the robberies. 5 Wilna, April 19-21, 1919. On April 19, Polish detachments entered the city of Wilna. The city was definitely taken by the Poles after 3 days of street fighting, during which time they lost 33 men killed. During the same period, some 65 Jews lost their lives. From the evidence submitted, it appears that none of these people, among whom were 4 women and 8 men over 50 years of age, had served with the Bolsheviks. 8 Jews were marched 3 kilometers to the outskirts of Wilna and deliberately shot without a semblance of a trial or investigation. Others were shot by soldiers who were robbing Jewish houses. No list has been furnished in the mission of any Polish civilians killed during the occupation. It is, however, stated on behalf of the government that the civilian inhabitants of Wilna took part on both sides in this fighting, and that some civilians fired upon the soldiers. Over 2,000 Jewish houses and stores in the city were entered by Polish soldiers and civilians during these 3 days, and the inhabitants robbed and beaten. It is claimed by the Jewish community that the consequent losses amounted to over 10 million rubles. Many of the poorest families were robbed of their shoes and blankets. Hundreds of Jews were arrested and deported from the city. Some of them were herded into boxcars and kept without food or water for 4 days. Old men and children were carried away without trial or investigation. 2 of these prisoners have since died from the treatment they received. Included in this list were some of the most prominent Jews of Wilna, such as the eminent Jewish writers Jaff and Niger. For days the families of these prisoners were without news from them and feared that they had been killed. The soldiers also broke into the synagogue and mutilated the sacred scrolls of the law. Up to August 3, 1919, when the mission was in Wilna, none of the soldiers or civilians responsible for these excesses had been punished. 6 Kolbasa, May 7, 1919. For a few days before May 7, 1919, the Jews of Kolbasa feared that excesses might take place, as there had been riots in the neighboring towns of Arzazu and Glogau. These riots had been the result of political agitation in this district and of excitement caused by a case of alleged ritual murder in which the Jewish defendant had been acquitted. On May 6, a company of soldiers was ordered to Kolbasa to prevent the threatened trouble. Early in the morning of May 7, a great number of peasants, among whom were many former soldiers of the Austrian army, entered the town. The rioters disarmed the soldiers after 2 soldiers and 3 peasants had been killed. They then proceeded to rob the Jewish stores and to beat any Jews who fell into their hands. 8 Jews were killed during this excess. Order was restored when a new detachment of soldiers arrived late in the afternoon. One of the rioters has since been tried and executed by the Polish government. 7 Częstochowa, May 27, 1919. On May 27, 1919, at Częstochowa, a shot fired by an unknown person slightly wounded a Polish soldier. A rumor spread that the shot had been fired by the Jews, and riots broke out in the city in which Polish soldiers and civilians took part. During these riots, 5 Jews, including a doctor who was hurrying to aid one of the injured, were beaten to death and a large number were wounded. French officers, who were stationed at Częstochowa, took an active part in preventing further murders. 8 Minsk, August 8, 1919. On August 8, 1919, the Polish troops took the city of Minsk from the Russian Bolsheviks. The Polish troops entered the city at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and by 12 o'clock they had absolute control. Notwithstanding the presence in Minsk of Gen. Jadwin and other members of this mission, and the orders of the Polish commanding general forbidding violence against civilians, 31 Jews were killed by the soldiers. Only one of this number can in any way be connected with the Bolshevist movement. 18 of the deaths appear to have been deliberate murder. 2 of these murders were incident to robberies, but the rest were committed, to all appearances, solely on the ground that the victims were Jews. During the afternoon and in the evening of August 8, the Polish soldiers, aided by civilians, plundered 377 shops, all of which belonged to Jews. It must be noted, however, that about 90% of the stores in Minsk are owned by Jews. No effective attempt was made to prevent these robberies until the next morning, when adequate officers' patrols were sent out through the streets and order was established. The private houses of many of the Jews were also broken into by soldiers and the inhabitants were beaten and robbed. The Polish government has stated that 4 Polish soldiers were killed while attempting to prevent robberies. It has also been stated to the mission that some of the rioters have been executed. 7. There have also been here and there individual cases of murder not enumerated in the preceding paragraphs, but their detailed description has not been considered necessary inasmuch as they present no characteristics not already observed in the principal excesses. In considering these excesses as a whole, it should be borne in mind that of the 8 cities and towns of which striking disorders have occurred, only Kielce and Częstochowa are within the boundaries of Congress Poland. In Kielce and Kolbasa the excesses were committed by city civilians and by peasants, respectively. At Częstochowa both civilians and soldiers took part in the disorders. At Pinsk the excess was essentially the fault of one officer. In Lemberg, Lida, Wilna, and Minsk the excesses were committed by the soldiers who were capturing the cities and not by the civilian population. In the 3 last-named cities the anti-Semitic prejudice of the soldiers had been inflamed by the charge that the Jews were Bolsheviks, while at Lemberg it was associated with the idea that the Jews were making common cause with the Ukrainians. These excesses were, therefore, political as well as anti-Semitic in character. The responsibility for these excesses is borne for the most part by the undisciplined and ill-equipped Polish recruits, who, and controlled by their inexperienced and oft-times timid officers, sought to profit at the expense of that portion of the population which they regarded as alien and hostile to Polish nationality and aspirations. It is recognized that the enforcement of discipline in a new and untrained army is a matter of extreme difficulty. On the other hand, the prompt cessation of disorder in Lemberg after the adoption of appropriate measures of control shows that an unflinching determination to restore order and firm application of repressive measures can prevent or at least limit such excesses. It is, therefore, believed that a more aggressive punitive policy and a more general publicity for reports of judicial and military prosecutions would have minimized subsequent excesses by discouraging the belief among the soldiery that robbery and violence could be committed with impunity. 8. Just as the Jews would resent being condemned as a race for the action of a few of their undesirable coreligionists, so it would be correspondingly unfair to condemn the Polish nation as a whole for the violence committed by uncontrolled troops or local mobs. These excesses were apparently not premeditated, for if they had been part of a preconceived plan, the number of victims would have run into the thousands instead of amounting to about 280. It is believed that these excesses were the result of a widespread anti-Semitic prejudice aggravated by the belief that the Jewish inhabitants were politically hostile to the Polish state. When the boundaries of Poland are once fixed and the internal organization of the country is perfected, the Polish government will be increasingly able to protect all classes of Polish citizenry. Since the Polish Republic has subscribed to the treaty which provides for the protection of racial, religious and linguistic minorities, it is confidently anticipated that the government will wholeheartedly accept the responsibility, not only of guarding certain classes of its citizens from aggression, but also of educating the masses beyond the state of mind that makes such aggression possible. 9. Besides these excesses, there have been reported to the mission numerous cases of other forms of persecutions. Thus, in almost every one of the cities and towns of Poland, Jews have been stopped by the soldiers and had their beards either torn out or cut off. As the Orthodox Jews feel that the shaving of their beards is contrary to their religious belief, this form of persecution has a particular significance to them. Jews also have been beaten and forced from trains and railroad stations. As a result, many of them are afraid to travel. The result of all these minor persecutions is to keep the Jewish population in a state of ferment and to subject them to the fear that graver excesses may again occur. 10. Whereas it has been easy to determine the excesses which took place and to fix the approximate number of deaths, it was more difficult to establish the extent of anti-Jewish discrimination. This discrimination finds its most conspicuous manifestation in the form of an economic boycott. The National Democratic Party has continuously agitated the economic strangling of the Jews. Through the press and political announcements, as well as by public speeches, the non-Jewish element of the Polish people is urged to abstain from dealing with the Jews. Landowners are warned not to sell their property to Jews, and in some cases where such sales have been made, the names of the offenders have been posted within blackboarded notices, stating that such vendors were
dead to Poland.
Even at the present time, this campaign is being waged by most of the non-Jewish press, which constantly advocates that the economic boycott be used as a means of ridding Poland of its Jewish element. This agitation had created in the minds of some of the Jews the feeling that there is an invisible rope around their necks, and they claim that this is the worst persecution that they can be forced to endure. Non-Jewish laborers have in many cases refused to work side by side with Jews. The percentage of Jews in public office, especially those holding minor positions, such as railway employees, firemen, policemen, and the like, has been materially reduced since the present government has taken control. Documents have been furnished the mission showing that government-owned railways have discharged Jewish employees and given them certificates that they have been released for no other reason than that they belong to the Jewish race. 11. Furthermore, the establishment of cooperative stores is claimed by many Jewish traders to be a form of discrimination. It would seem, however, that this movement is a legitimate effort to restrict the activities and therefore the profits of the middleman. Unfortunately, when these stores were introduced into Poland, they were advertised as a means of eliminating the Jewish trader. The Jews have, therefore, been caused to feel that the establishment of cooperatives is an attack upon themselves. While the establishment and the maintenance of cooperatives may have been influenced by anti-Semitic sentiment, this is a form of economic activity which any community is perfectly entitled to pursue. On the other hand, the Jews complain that even the Jewish cooperatives and individual Jews are discriminated against by the government in the distribution of government-controlled supplies. 12. The government has denied that discrimination against Jews has been practiced as a government policy, so it has not denied that there may be individual cases where anti-Semitism has played a part. Assurances have been made to the mission by official authorities that insofar as it lies within the power of the government, this discrimination will be corrected. 13. In considering the causes for the anti-Semitic feeling which has brought about the manifestations described above, it must be remembered that ever since the partition of 1795 the Poles have striven to be reunited as a nation and to regain their freedom. This continual effort to keep alive their national aspirations has caused them to look with hatred upon anything which might interfere with their aims. This has led to a conflict with the nationalist declarations of some of the Jewish organizations which desire to establish cultural autonomy financially supported by the state. In addition, the position taken by the Jews in favor of Article 93 of the Treaty of Versailles, guaranteeing protection to racial, linguistic and religious minorities in Poland, has created a further resentment against them. Moreover, Polish national feeling is irritated by what is regarded as the
alien
character of the great mass of the Jewish population. This is constantly brought home to the Poles by the fact that the majority of the Jews affect a distinctive dress, observe the Sabbath on Saturday, conduct business on Sunday, have separate dietary laws, wear long beards, and speak a language of their own. The basis of this language is a German dialect, and the fact that Germany was, and still is, looked upon by the Poles as an enemy country renders this vernacular especially unpopular. The concentration of the Jews in separate districts or quarters in Polish cities also emphasizes the line of demarcation separating them from other citizens. 14. The strained relations between the Jews and non-Jews have been further increased not only by the Great War, during which Poland was the battleground for the Russian, German, and Austrian armies, but also by the present conflicts with the Bolsheviks and the Ukrainians. The economic condition of Poland is at its lowest ebb. Manufacturing and commerce have virtually ceased. Shortage, the high price, and the imperfect distribution of food are a dangerous menace to the health and welfare of the urban population. As a result, hundreds of thousands are suffering from hunger and are but half-clad, while thousands are dying of disease and starvation. The cessation of commerce is particularly felt by the Jewish population, which are almost entirely dependent upon it. Owing to the condition described, prices have doubled and tripled, and the population has become irritated against the Jewish traders, whom it blames for the abnormal increase thus occasioned. 15. The great majority of Jews in Poland belong to separate Jewish political parties. The largest of these are the Orthodox, the Zionist, and the National. Since the Jews form separate political groups, it is probable that some of the Polish discrimination against them is political rather than anti-Semitic in character. The dominant Polish parties give to their supporters government positions and government patronage. It is to be hoped, however, that the Polish majority will not follow this system in the case of positions which are not essentially political. There should be no discrimination in the choice of professors and teachers, nor in the selection of railroad employees, policemen and firemen, or the incumbents of any other positions which are placed under the civil service in England and the United States. Like other democracies, Poland must realize that these positions must not be drawn into politics. Efficiency can only be attained if the best men are employed, irrespective of party or religion. 16. The relations between the Jews and non-Jews will undoubtedly improve in a strong democratic Poland. To hasten this, there should be reconciliation and cooperation between the 86% Christians and the 14% Jews. These 86% must realize that they cannot present a solid front against their neighbors if 1/7 of the population is discontented, fear-stricken, and inactive. The minority must be encouraged to participate with their whole strength and influence in making Poland a great unified country that is required in Central Europe to combat the tremendous dangers that confront it. Poland must promptly develop its full strength and by its conduct first merit and then receive the unstinted moral, financial and economic support of all the world, which will ensure the future success of the Republic. 17. It was impossible for the mission, during the 2 months it was in Poland, to do more than acquaint itself with the general condition of the people. To formulate a solution of the Jewish problem will necessitate careful and broad study, not only of the economic condition of the Jews, but also of the exact requirements of Poland. These requirements will not be definitely known prior to the fixation of Polish boundaries and the final regulation of Polish relations with Russia, with which the largest share of trade was previously conducted. It is recommended that the League of Nations or the larger nations interested in this problem send to Poland a commission consisting of recognized industrial, educational, agricultural, economic and vocational experts, which should remain there as long as necessary to examine the problem at its source. 18. This commission should devise a plan by which the Jews in Poland can secure the same economic and social opportunities as are enjoyed by their coreligionists in other free countries. A new Polish constitution is now in the making. The generous scope of this national instrument has already been indicated by the special treaty with the Allied and associated powers, in which Poland has affirmed its fidelity to the principles of liberty and justice and the rights of minorities, and we may be certain that Poland will be faithful to its pledge, which is so conspicuously in harmony with the nation's best traditions. A new life will thus be opened to the Jews, and it will be the task of the proposed commission to fit them to profit thereby and to win the same appreciation gained by their coreligionists elsewhere as a valued asset to the commonwealths in which they reside. The friends of the Jews in America, England, and elsewhere, who have already evinced such great interest in their welfare, will enthusiastically grasp the opportunity to cooperate in working out any good solution that such a commission may propound. The fact that it may take 1 or 2 generations to reach the goal must not be discouraging. 19. All citizens of Poland should realize that they must live together. They cannot be divorced from each other by force or by any court of law. When this idea is once thoroughly comprehended, every effort will necessarily be directed toward a better understanding and the amelioration of existing conditions, rather than toward augmenting antipathy and discontent. The Polish nation must see that its worst enemies are those who encourage this internal strife. A house divided against itself cannot stand. There must be but one class of citizens in Poland, all members of which enjoy equal rights and render equal duties. Respectfully submitted. Henry Morgenthau. American Commission to Negotiate Peace. Warsaw, 10 August, 1919. My dear Mr. President, In compliance with your request to submit to you in writing the suggestions I made to you last evening, I desire to state that the interest of President Wilson and a citizen of the United States was not only to investigate the various occurrences during and after the occupation of some of the cities in your country as well as the alleged persecutions of the Jews, but also to ascertain the entire matter so objectively, impartially, and disinterestedly as to enable the Commission correctly to diagnose the difficulties and suggest a remedy. Although our investigations are by no means completed, I have discovered that some of the main causes of your troubles are the inevitable results of conditions that your country has gradually drifted into, and are due to the fact that the release of the various sections of your country from them to the objectionable rule by foreign potentates came so suddenly that it found them unprepared to face and successfully grapple with the complicated problems resulting therefrom. Poland, having at last had all her dreams realized, her ambitions more than gratified, finds herself economically prostrate on her back, yet too proud to ask for outside assistance. Her splendid pride has at all times to be considered by anyone who wishes to be of any use to the country. I feel that Poland possesses great resiliency and has much latent potentiality, and all she requires is to be given some confidence in herself and to be shown how to
help herself.
The new, proud Polish Republic not only requires personal liberty, but as much freedom as possible from obligations to others for the exercise of the same. I firmly believe that when she is enabled to do this, she will ungrudgingly grant to her minorities the same privilege. I am anxious to show Poland how she can rise from her prostrate position and discover that she has adequate strength, with very little propping, to start a brisk walk toward the goal she is aiming for: self-reliant, successful independence. It has occurred to me that if in her earliest steps she will permit her good friends, the other members of the League of Nations, to assist her with tender sympathy and unselfish, fraternal feeling, that she will be astonished at the rapidity of her progress. You need to have proclaimed for your government, your people, and the world that your associates believe in you and want you to become a strong country, and are anxious to have you promptly develop that strength, for reasons too obvious to mention. It has occurred to me that what you require is a proper currency system and sufficient funds to enable you to secure adequate raw material and fuel that will justify your factories in starting off at full speed and not having to fear an early suspension of their activities. And you will have to establish some institution that will restore confidence in your population who, as I am reliably informed, are at present hiding and therefore not using a substantial part of your liquid financial resources. A corporation should be organized with $150 million capital. The right to subscribe should be divided 1/3 to Poland, 1/3 to the United States, and 1/3 to England, France, Italy, etc. The stock should be paid in installments, particularly as to those shares subscribed for by Polish capital, as it is desirable that the Poles be given sufficient time so as to secure personally the benefits of the tremendous rise in the value of your marks which would result from the creation of this company. For this purpose I suggest 5 or 6 installments, extending over a year or longer. The sum of $50,000 or $60,000 should be spent for publicity, for subscriptions in all of your newspapers, and great stress should be laid on the fact that the mass of your people is to receive the preference in the allotment of stock. A systematic campaign, something like our Liberty Loan campaigns, should be organized so as to create the proper sentiment in the country, to encourage rivalry between your various large cities and rouse the patriotism of all your citizens. Care should be taken in the constitution of these committees so as to make them platforms for the promotion of better feeling amongst your people. All subscriptions of $100 or less should be allotted in full. This would satisfy your population that it was to be a genuine Polish people's institution. After a dividend of 6% is paid on the stock, the balance of the profits should be divided equally between the stockholders and the state. The profits paid to the state to be in lieu of all taxes. This would work both ways. It would satisfy the people that the state is to have its share, and it would satisfy the investors that they could not be subjected, in any possible changed form of government of Poland, to excessive taxation. The establishment of such a corporation would at once create a large permanent credit for Poland. This corporation could assume the responsibility of contracts for large quantities of cotton, wool, and produce ships and all necessary requirements for Poland's resumption of activities. Branches of the corporation should be established in all the large cities. I believe from conversations I have had with representative men in Wilno that they would subscribe largely to the stock, because I told them that although America would very likely be willing to participate in the creation of a large central institution for Poland with its headquarters at Warsaw and branches in the larger cities, it would certainly not be interested in a local institution in Wilno. It has occurred to me that cities like Wilno, Lemberg, Krakow and Lodz, etc. would vie with each other in subscribing to this institution if they were told that the capital allotted to their district would depend upon their subscriptions. It would be safe to say to them that there would be $2 of foreign capital for every dollar that they would subscribe. It seems highly important that England be interested in this cooperation, because if the United States suggests its organization, we must promptly assure all other countries, including the neutrals during the recent war, that America expects no commercial advantage over any other country in Poland. I deem it very desirable that the stock owned by foreigners should contain a provision that the Polish government, or a syndicate of which they would approve, would have the right at any time to buy the stock from the owners at from $125 to $150 per share. This would serve a double purpose. It would do away with any desire on the part of the Poles to have control of the institution from the very start, because they would know that at any time they could secure the same, and it would enable them to feel that this important concern could be made entirely Polish whenever their strength justified it, and the foreign owners would, on the other hand, feel that they would receive a proper compensation for their risk, and they would have rendered a fine service not only to Poland, but to the entire world in accelerating the development of Poland's economic strength. I have carefully canvassed the available material in the United States for the president of this institution and suggest to you that we secure Secretary of the Interior, Franklin K. Lane. There are few men in the United States that more deservedly possess the admiration and approval of all Americans. He is a man who is entirely free from any financial alliances and therefore cannot be criticized on that score. Incidentally, it would be of the greatest service to your government to have one of the greatest experts in the science of government accessible to your cabinet and functionaries. As you no doubt remember, he has not only successfully administered that great Department of the Interior, but also was member and chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission of the United States. He was selected by President Wilson as one of the commissioners that was sent to Mexico and for other commissions. I have every reason to feel that President Wilson, although reluctantly, would consent to Secretary Lane's responding to this call. I think that the mere announcement of the contemplation of such an institution will electrify your people and will replace the present pessimism with an optimism that will astound all of us. If you and your associates in the government of Poland approve of the suggestion, our commission is ready and anxious to help you and such representatives of England, France, Italy, and other countries as you may invite to join us, promptly to work out the details and make this thought a living thing. With kindest personal regards, yours very truly, Henry Morgenthau. Hun. Ignace Paderewski, President of the Council of Ministers, Warsaw. Mandates or war? World peace had to be menaced unless the United States assumes control of the Sultan's former dominions. I am one of those who believe that the United States should accept a mandate for Constantinople and the several provinces in Asia Minor which constitute what is left of the Ottoman Empire. I am aware that this proposition is not popular with the American people, but it seems to me to be a matter in which we do not have much choice. Nations, like individuals, are constantly subject to forces which are stronger than their wills. The responsibilities which nations inherit, like the responsibilities to which individuals fall heir, are frequently not of their own choosing. The great European conflict in August 1914 seemed to be a matter that did not immediately concern us. In 2 years we learned that it was very much our affair. The impelling forces of history drew us in and led us to play a decisive part. If we could not keep out of this struggle, it is illogical to suppose that we can avoid its consequences. One of the most serious of these consequences, and the one that perhaps most threatens the peace of the world, is a chaotic Turkey. Unless the United States accepts a Turkish mandate, the world will again lose the opportunity of solving the problem that has endangered civilization for 500 years. The United States has invested almost $40 billion in a war against militarism and for the establishment of right. We must invest 3 or 4 billions more in an attempt to place on a permanent foundation the nations to whose rescue we came. An essential part of this program is the expulsion of Turk from Europe and the establishment as going concerns of the nations which have been so long subject to his tyranny. Unless we succeed in doing this, we can look for another Balkan War in a brief period, perhaps 5 years. Another Balkan War will mean another European war, another World War. It is for the United States to decide whether such a calamity shall visit the world at an early date. If we assume the mandate for Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire, probably we can prevent it. If, as so many Americans insist, we reject this duty, we shall become responsible for another world conflagration. Perhaps the most ominous phase of world politics today is that new voices are interceding in behalf of the Sultan and his distracted domain. The government at Constantinople is making one last despairing attempt to save the bedraggled remnants of its empire. It has reorganized its cabinet, put into the 4 men who are expected to impress Europe favorably, but it is not punishing the leaders who sold out to Germany and murdered not far from 1 million of its Christian subjects. The new Sultan has given interviews to the press, expressing his horror at the Armenian massacres and promising that nothing like them shall ever occur again. More ominous than these outgivings is the fact that certain spokesmen in behalf of the Turk are making themselves heard in the Allied countries. Again, it is being said that what Turkey needs is not obliteration as a state, but reform. Probably the financial interests which look upon Turkey as a field for concessions are largely responsible for this talk. The imperialistic tendencies of certain European countries are blameable to a certain extent, for strange as it may seem, there are still many people in England, France, and Italy who urge that the Turk, bad as his instincts may be, is better than the Oriental peoples whom he holds in subjection. If we listen to these arguments and to the fair promises of the Turkish government, we shall put ourselves into the position of a society which fails to protect itself against the habitual criminal. Every civilized society nowadays sees to it that constant offenders against decency and law are put where they can do no harm. Yet the Turk is the habitual criminal of history, the constant offender against the peace and dignity of the world, and if we permit him to remain in Europe and to retain an uncontrolled sovereignty, it is easy to foresee the time when a regenerated Russia will again be dependent on him for a commercial outlet, so that the dangerous situation of the old world order will be duplicated and perpetuated. We cannot hope sanely for peace unless America establishes at Constantinople a center from which democratic principles shall radiate and illuminate that dark region of the world. If we look at the Near Eastern situation, we perceive that Italy and Greece are reaching out to such distances for territory and power that both, if their ambitions are gratified, will find themselves not only unable to govern the new lands they have acquired, but will be greatly weakened at home through expenditures in the maintenance of troops and governments in their colonies. The danger is not only that the Balkans will be more Balkanized than ever, but that Russia, too, will be Balkanized. The only safety lies in setting up a beneficent influence through a strong government in Constantinople, which would counteract the intrigues and contentions of embittered rivals. A brief survey of the history of Turkey in Europe will suffice to make clear the danger of accepting in this late day any promises of reform from that quarter. I have always thought that the final word on Turkey was spoken by an American friend of mine who had spent a large part of his life in the East, and who, on a visit to Berlin, was asked by Herr von Gwinner, the president of the Deutsche Bank, to spend an evening with him to discuss the future of the Sultan's empire. When my friend came to keep this appointment, he began this way.
You have set aside this whole evening to discuss the Ottoman Empire. We do not need all that time. I can tell you the whole story in just 4 words. Turkey is not reformable. You have summed up the whole situation perfectly,
replied von Gwinner. The reason why this conclusion was so accurate was that it was based not upon theory, but upon experiment. The history of Turkey for nearly 100 years has simply amounted to an attempt to reform her. Every attempt has ignominiously failed. Up to 15 years ago, Great Britain's policy in the Near East had as its controlling principle the necessity of maintaining the independence and integrity of the Ottoman Empire. The folly of this policy and the miseries which it has brought to Europe are so apparent that I propose to discuss the matter in some detail, particularly as it is only by studying this attitude of the past that we can approach the solution of the Turkish problem of the present. From 1853 to 1856, Great Britain and France fought a terrible, devastating war, the one purpose of which was to maintain the independence of Turkey. At this time the British public had before them the Turkish problem in almost the same form as that which it manifests today. As now, the issue turned upon whether they should regard this question from the standpoint of civilization and decency or from the standpoint of national advantage and political expediency. The character of the Turk was the same in 1853 that it is now. He was just as incapable politically then as he is today. His attitude toward the Christian populations whom the accident of history had placed in his power was identically the same as it is now. These populations were merely
filthy infidels,
hated by Allah, having no rights to their own lives or property, who would be permitted to live only as slaves of the mighty Muslim, and who could be tortured and murdered at will. All European statesmen knew in 1852 that the ultimate disappearance of the Ottoman Empire was inevitable. All understood that it was only the support of certain European powers that permitted it to exist, even temporarily. It was about this time that Tsar Nicholas I applied to Turkey the name
sick man of the East,
which has ever since been accepted as an accurate description of its political and social status. The point which I wish to make here is that that phrase is just as appropriate today as it was then. The Turk had long since learned the great resources of Ottoman statesmanship, the adroit balancing of one European power against another as the one security of his own existence. Yet there was then a school of statesmanship, headed by Palmerston, which declared that the preservation of this decrepit power was the indispensable point in British foreign policy. These men were as realistic in their policies as Bismarck himself. Outwardly they expressed their faith in the Turk. They publicly pictured him as a charming and chivalrous gentleman. They declared that the stories of his brutality were fabrications, and they asserted that, once given an opportunity, the Turkish Empire would regain its splendor and become a headquarters of intelligence and toleration. Lord Palmerston simply outdid himself in his adulation of the Turk. He publicly denounced the Christian populations of Turkey. The stories of their sufferings he declared to be the most absurd nonsense. He warned the British public against being led astray by cheap sentimentality in dealing with the Turkish problem. To what extent Palmerston and his associates believed their own statements is not clear. They were trained in a school of statesmanship which taught that it was well to believe what it was convenient to believe. The fact was, of course, that the British public was under no particular hallucinations about the Turk, but its mind was filled with a great obsession and a great fear. The thing that paralyzed its moral sense was the steady progress of Russia. This power, starting as a landlocked nation, had gradually pushed her way to the Black Sea. There was something in her steady progress southward that seemed almost as inevitable as fate. That Russia was determined to obtain Constantinople and become heir to the Sultan's empire was the conviction that obsessed the British mind. Once this happened, the Palmerston School declared, the British Empire would come speedily to an end. It is almost impossible for us of this generation to conceive the extent to which this fear of Russia laid hold of the British mind. It dogged all the thoughts of British statesmen and British publicists. There appeared to be only one way of checking Russia and protecting the British fireside, that was to preserve the Turkish Empire. England believed that, as long as the Sultan ruled at Constantinople, the Russian could never occupy that capital and from it menace the British Empire. Thus British enthusiasm for Turkey was merely an expression of hatred and fear of Russia. It was this that led British statesmen to disregard the humane principles involved and adopt a course that apparently promoted their national advantage. The English situation of 1853 presented in particularly acute form that question which has always troubled statesmen: is there any such thing as principle in the conduct of a nation, or is a country justified always in adopting the course that best promotes its interests or which seems to do so? As applied to Turkey it was this: was it Great Britain's duty to protect the Christians against the murderous attacks of the Mohammedans, or should she shut her eyes to their sufferings so long as this course proved profitable politically? I should be doing an injustice to England did I not point out that the British public has always been divided on this issue. One side has always insisted on regarding the Turkish problem as a matter simply of expediency, while another has insisted on solving it on the ground of justice and right. The party of humanity existed in the days of the Crimean War. Their leaders were Richard Cobbett and John Bright, men who formed the vanguard in that group of British statesmen who insisted on regarding public questions from other than materialistic standpoints. Cobden and Bright saw in the Ottoman question as it presented itself in 1853 not chiefly a problem in the balance of power, but one that affected the lives of millions of human beings. It was not the threatened aggression of Russia that disturbed them. Their eyes were fixed rather on the Christian populations that were being daily tortured under Turkish rule. They demanded a solution of the Eastern question in the way that would best promote the welfare of the Armenians, Greeks, Syrians, and Jews, whom the Sultan had maltreated for centuries. They cared little for the future of Constantinople. They cared much for the future of these persecuted peoples. They therefore took what was, I am sorry to say, the unpopular side in that day. They opposed the mad determination of the British public to go to war for the sake of maintaining the Turkish Empire. The greatest speech John Bright ever made was against the Crimean War.
That terrible oppression, that multitudinous crime which we call the Ottoman Empire,
was his description of the country which Palmerston so greatly admired. Richard Cobden had studied conditions at first hand and had reached a conclusion identically the same as that of my friend whom I have already quoted, that is, that Turkey was not reformable. He ridiculed the fear that everywhere prevailed against Russia, denied that Russia's prosperity as a nation necessarily endangered Great Britain, declared that the Turkish Empire could not be maintained, and that, even though it could be, it was not worth preserving.
You must address yourselves,
said Cobden,
as men of sense and men of energy, to the question, what are you to do with the Christian population? For Mohammedanism cannot be maintained, and I should be sorry to see this country fighting for the maintenance of Mohammedanism. You may keep Turkey on the map of Europe, you may call the country by the name of Turkey if you like, but do not think that you can keep up the Mohammedan ruler in the country.
These were about the mightiest voices in England at that time, but even Cobden and Bright were wildly abused for maintaining that the Eastern question was primarily a problem in ethics. In order to preserve this hideous anachronism, England fought a bloody and disastrous war. I presume most Englishmen today regard the Crimean War as about the most wicked and futile in their national existence. When the whole thing was over, a witty Frenchman summed up the performance by saying,
If we read the Treaty of Peace, there are no visible signs to show who were the conquerors and who the vanquished.
There was only one power which could view the results with much satisfaction, that was Turkey. The Treaty of Paris specifically guaranteed her independence and integrity. It shut the Black Sea to naval vessels, thus protecting Turkey from attack by Russia. Worst of all, it left the Sultan's Christian subjects absolutely in his power. The Sultan did, indeed, promise reforms, but he merely promised them. Despite experience to the contrary, the British and French diplomats blandly accepted this promise as equivalent to performance. It is painful to look back to this year 1856 to realize that France and England, having defeated Russia, had a free hand to solve the Ottoman problem, and that they refrained from doing so. That absurd proposition that this Oriental empire must be preserved in Europe simply as a buffer state against the progress of Russia entirely controlled the minds of British statesmen, and millions of Christian people were left to their fate. What that fate was we all know. The Sultan's promises of reform, never made in good faith, were immediately disregarded. Pillage, massacre, and lust continued to be the chief instruments used by the Sublime Porte in governing its subject peoples. Again the Sultan maintained his throne by playing off one European power against another. The
settlement
of the Eastern problem, which had been provided by the Crimean War, lasted until 1876. These 20 years were not quiet ones in the Ottoman dominions. They were a time of constant misery and torture for the abandoned Christian populations. Great Britain and France learned precisely what the
integrity and independence of the Ottoman Empire
meant in 1876, when stories of the Bulgarian massacres again reached Europe. Once more Europe faced this everlasting question of the Turk in precisely the same form as in 1856. Again the British people had to decide between expediency and principle in deciding the future of Turkey. Again the British public divided into two groups. Palmerston was dead, but his animosity to Russia and his fondness for the Turk had become the inheritance of Disraeli. With this statesman, as with his predecessor, Turkey was a nation that must be preserved, whatever might be the lot of her suffering Christians. The other part, that played by Cobden and Bright in 1856, was now played by Gladstone.
The greatest triumph of our time,
said Gladstone in 1870,
will be the enthronement of the idea of public right as the governing idea of European politics.
And Gladstone now proposed to apply his lofty principles to this new Turkish crisis. Many of us remember the attitude of the Disraeli government in those days. We are still proud of the part played by two Americans, McGahan, a newspaper correspondent, and Schuyler, the American consul at Constantinople, in bringing the real facts to the attention of the civilized world. Until these men published the results of their investigations, the Disraeli government branded all the reports of Bulgarian atrocities as lies.
Coffee House Babble
Was the term applied by Disraeli to these reports, while Lord Salisbury, in a public address, lauded the personal character of the Sultan. But these two Americans showed that the Bulgarian reports were not idle gossip. They furnished Gladstone his material for his famous Bulgarian pamphlet, in which he propounded the only solution of the Turkish problem that should satisfy the conscience of the British people. His words, uttered in 1876, are just as timely now as they were then.
Let the Turks now carry away their abuses in the only possible manner, namely, by carrying away themselves. Their Zaptis and their Mudias, their Banbashes and their Yugbashes, their Kaimakans and their Pashas, one and all, bag and baggage, shall, I hope, clear out from the province they have desolated and profaned.
Gladstone's denunciation stirred the British conscience to its depths. The finer side of the British character manifested itself. The public conscience had made great advances since 1856, and the masses of the British people began to see the Ottoman problem in its true light. Consequently, when Russia intervened in behalf of the Bulgarians and other persecuted peoples, England did not commit the fearful mistake of 1853. She did not go to war to prevent the intervention. British public opinion at first applauded the Russian armies. When, however, the Tsar's forces approached Constantinople, the old dread of Crimean days seized the British public once more. Again Englishmen forgot the miseries of the Christians and began to see the spectre of Russia seated at Constantinople. Again Great Britain began to prepare for war. A British fleet passed the Dardanelles and anchored off Constantinople. England again declared that the safety of her empire demanded the preservation of Turkey, and gave Russia the option of war or a congress at which the treaty she had made with Turkey should be revised. Russia accepted the latter alternative, and the Congress of Berlin was the result. This Congress could have freed all the subject peoples and solved the Eastern question, but again civilized Europe threw away the opportunity. At this Congress England, in the person of Disraeli, became the Sultan's advocate, and again the Sultan came out victorious. Certain territories he lost, it is true, but Constantinople was left in his hands, and a great area of the Balkans and the larger part of Asia Minor. As for the Armenians, the Syrians, the Greeks, and the Macedonians, the world once more accepted from Turkey promises of reform. Thus Gladstone and the most enlightened opinion in England lost their battle, and British authority again became the instrument for preserving that
terrible oppression, that multitudinous crime which we call the Ottoman Empire.
Had it not been for the Congress of Berlin, it is possible that we should never have had the World War. The treaty let Austria into Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so laid the basis for the ultimatum of July 22, 1914. It failed to settle the fate of Macedonia, and so made inevitable the Balkan Wars. By leaving Turkey an independent sovereignty, with its capital on the Bosphorus, it made possible the intrigues of Germany for a great Oriental empire. No wonder Gladstone denounced it as an
insane covenant.
The
most deplorable chapter in our foreign policy since the Peace of 1815.
The plenipotentiaries,
he said,
have spoken in the terms of Metternich rather than those of Canning.
It was their part to take the side of liberty. As a matter of fact, they took the side of servitude.
The greatest sufferers, as always, were the Christian populations. The Sultan treated his promises of 1878 precisely as he had treated those of 1856. It was after this treaty, indeed, that Abdul-Hamid adopted his systematic plan of solving the Armenian problem by massacring all the Armenians. The condition of the subject peoples became worse as years went on, until finally in 1915 we had the most terrible persecutions in history. The Russian terror, if it ever was a terror, has disappeared. England no longer fears a Russia stationed at Constantinople and threatening her Indian empire. The once mighty giant now lies a hopelessly crippled invalid, utterly incapable of aggressive action against any nation. What her fate will be no one knows. What is certain, however, is that the old Tsaristic empire, constantly bent on military aggression, has disappeared forever. When we look upon Russia today, and then think of the terror which she inspired in the hearts of British statesmen 40 and 62 years ago, the contrast is almost pitiful and grotesque. The nation that succeeded Russia as an ambitious heir to the Sultan's dominions, Germany, is now almost as powerless. Moreover, the British conscience has changed since the days of the Crimean and Russo-Turkish wars. The old-time attitude, which insisted on regarding these problems from the standpoint of fancied national interest, is every day giving place to a more humanitarian policy. Gladstone's idea of
public right as the governing idea of European politics
is more and more gaining the upper hand. The ideals in foreign policy represented by Cobden and Bright are the ideals that now control British public opinion. There are still plenty of reactionaries in England and Europe that might like to settle the Ottoman problem in their old discredited way, but they do not govern British public life at the present crisis. The England that will deal with the Ottoman Empire in 1919 is the England of Lloyd George, not the England of Palmerston and Disraeli. For the first time, therefore, the world approaches the problem of the Ottoman Empire, the greatest blight in modern civilization, with an absolutely free hand. The decision will inform us, more eloquently than any other detail in the settlement, precisely what forces have won in this war. We shall learn from it whether we have really entered upon a new epoch, whether, as we hope, medieval history has ended and modern history has begun. If Constantinople is left to the Turk, if the Greeks, the Syrians, the Armenians, the Arabs and the Jews are not freed from the most revolting tyranny that history has ever known, we shall understand that the sacrifices of the last 4 years have been in vain, and that the much discussed new ideals in the government of the world are the merest cant. Thus the United States has an immediate interest in the solution of this problem. The hints reaching this country that another effort may be made to prop up the Turk are not pleasing to us. We did not enter this war to set up new balances of power, to promote the interests of concessionaries, to make new partitions of territory to satisfy the imperialistic ambitions of contending European powers, but to lend our support to that new international conscience that seeks to reorganize the world on the basis of justice and popular rights. The settlement of the Eastern question will teach us to what extent our efforts have succeeded. If this mistake of propping up the Sultan's empire is not to be made again, either that empire must be divided among the great powers, a solution which is not to be considered for reasons which it is hardly necessary to explain, or one of these great powers must undertake its administration as a mandatory. The great powers in question are the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Of these only the first two are capable of assuming this duty. Lord Curzon has told me personally that for political and economic reasons Great Britain cannot assume the Ottoman mandate. Lloyd George has said essentially the same thing. And Stéphane Lawson, who speaks in a semi-official capacity for France, said in an interview North 1 with a correspondent of the Times,
in the offer of a mandate to her, America should see more than a selfish desire of Europe to involve her in European affairs. It is true she fears to be the center of intrigues and difficulties. She fears distant complications. However, the question is nobler and higher than that. America is an admirable reservoir of energy. She holds the secret of that which is best in our modern life, to build largely and to build quickly. She has youth, she has power, she has wealth, she has that which she calls efficiency. We in Europe are old, poor, enfeebled, divided. It would be prodigiously interesting if America, after she has given us of her power, of her money, and her material, should give us also an example. And what an example it would be if America were to accept the mandate for Constantinople. Here is a city which is one of the marvels of Europe and of the world, which is the jewel of the Orient, and which after 20 centuries of European civilization remains the home of wickedness and corruption. Every one disputes possession of its hills and harbours, and no one tries to make of it a great modern city which, rid of international intrigues and rid of politics, would be the shining pole of Europe. Only America can transform Constantinople, only America can establish herself there without suspicion of bad faith and without jealousy, only America can civilize the capital of Islam. To do that, America has no need of regiments of soldiers or of cannon. She has need only of her workers and her constructors. A Hoover or a Davison would be enough.
And America is full of Hoovers and Davisons.
I recognize the tremendous problems which confront us in our own country. Those problems must and will be solved. But the days past when the individual citizen had permitted absorption in his personal affairs to exclude the consideration of the community's or the nation's well-being. A new social conscience has manifested itself. And it is equally true that the United States, as a member of the League of Nations, must take an active and altruistic interest in world affairs, however pressing our own problems may seem. The European situation, indeed, is really a part of them. Our associates in the war cannot drift into bankruptcy and despair without involving the United States in a disaster. The losses we would suffer in money would be the least distressing should the world fall into the chaos which is threatening. If we cannot solve our own problems and at the same time help Europe solve hers, we must be impotent indeed. So much, then, for the general principles involved. What are the practical details of such a mandate? Last May, William Buckler, Professor Philip M. Brown, and myself joined in a memorandum to President Wilson outlining briefly a proposed system of government for the Ottoman dominions. This so completely embodies my ideas that I reprint it here, with 2 slight omissions.
The government of Asia Minor should be dealt with under 3 different mandates: 1 for Constantinople and its zone, 2 for Turkish Anatolia, 3 for Armenia. The reason for not uniting these 3 areas under a single mandate is that the methods of government required in each area are different. In order, however, to facilitate the political and economic development of the whole country, these 3 areas should be placed under one and the same mandatory power, with a single governor in charge of the whole, to unify the separate administrations of the 3 states. Honest and efficient government in the Constantinople zone and in Armenia will not solve the problems of Asia Minor unless the same kind of government is also provided for the much larger area lying between Constantinople and Armenia, i.e., Turkish Anatolia. Constantinople and Armenia are mere fringes. The heart of the problem lies in Anatolia, of which the population is 75% Muslim. The main rules to be followed in dealing with this central district are: 1. That it should not be divided up among Greeks, French, Italians, etc. 2. That the Sultan should, under proper mandatory control, retain religious and political sovereignty over the Turkish people in Anatolia, having his residence at Bursa or Konya, both of which are ancient historic seats of the Sultanate. 3. That no part of Anatolia should be placed under Greeks even in the form of a mandate. The Greeks are entitled by their numbers to a small area surrounding Smyrna. Under no circumstances should Greece have a mandate over territory mainly inhabited by Turks. The above solution of the problem of Asia Minor means refusal to recognize secret deals such as the Pact of London and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and especially the Italian claims to a large territory near Italia. If Greeks and Italians with their standing antagonism, are introduced into Asia Minor, the peace will constantly be disturbed by their rivalry and intrigues. Italy has no claim to any part of Anatolia, whether on the basis of population, of commercial interests, or of historic tradition. No solution of the Asia Minor problem which ignores the fact that its population is 75%. Turkish can be considered satisfactory or durable. The only two countries having any prospect of successfully holding a mandate over Anatolia are Great Britain and the United States. The large missionary and educational interests of the United States in Anatolia must be adequately protected, and it is illusory to imagine that this can be done if Anatolia is subjected to Greek, French, or Italian sovereignty. Only a comprehensive, self-contained scheme such as that above outlined can overcome the strong prejudices of the American people against accepting any mandate. To cure the ills of Turkey and to deliver her peasantry from their present ignorance and impoverishment requires a thorough reconstruction of Turkish institutions, judicial, educational, economic, financial, and military. This may appeal to the United States as an opportunity to set a high standard by showing that it is the duty of a great power in ruling such oppressed peoples to lead them towards self-respecting independence as their ultimate goal.
The Armenians are wholly unprepared to govern themselves or to protect themselves against their neighbors. Mere supervision will not be adequate. What the Armenian state requires is a kind of receivership, and we should take it over in trust, to manage it until it is time to turn it over when it is governmentally solvent and on a going basis. Anatolia should be under separate management and have its own parliament. Its executive should be a deputy governor under a governor-general at Constantinople. The three governments should have a common coinage, similar tariff requirements, and unified railroad systems, and in other respects should be federated somewhat as states in this country are. The commercial importance of such an arrangement is enormous, for Constantinople must continue as Russia's chief outlet to the world, and it is the gateway to the East. The commercial policy would, of course, be an open-door policy. All nations would have equality of opportunity in trade and would be free in regard to colonization. As a matter of fact, the commercial situation is of little importance to us. Prior to the war, our foreign trade amounted to only about 6% of our total trade, and although it increased during the war to about 11%, it is likely to recede soon to the neighborhood of 8%. It will consist largely of raw materials, such as wheat, cotton, copper, and coal, which other nations must get from us, whether or no. Foreign trade is a mere incident. Our prosperity is not what we are fighting for. It need not require the extension of large credits from us to put these nations on a sound footing. They could be financed by bond issues issued in each case against the resources of the territories involved. If the United States held the mandates, there would be no difficulty, I apprehend, in floating such issues. And as for the policing necessary, it need be very small, provided a man of strong will and quick decision, fertile in resources and of unshakable determination, were assigned to the governorship general at Constantinople. The opportunity would be a great one for an American completely imbued with our institutions. The succession of able proconsuls whom we have sent to the Philippines shows that we shall not lack such men. We shall surrender our mandates over these three territories when we have finished our work. We shall not necessarily leave them all at the same time. We shall turn each one over to its people when the public opinion of the world, expressed in the League of Nations, has decided that it is capable of directing its own affairs. It might be necessary for us to remain in Constantinople longer than elsewhere, and there is reason to suppose that Constantinople will become the Washington of the Balkans and perhaps of Asia Minor, the central governing power of the Balkan Confederation. But if left without the guidance and help of outside intelligence and capital, those peoples will necessarily continue to retrograde. They must have security of property if they are to have an incentive to labor. Unless they have that, the blight of southeastern Europe will remain, and the Turks, originally a marauding band of conquerors, who have held a precarious and undeserved footing for more than 500 years on European soil, will continue to menace its peace and safety. If ever there was a chance to put them out, we have that chance now. The United States is the only government which can undertake the purification of the Balkans without incurring ill will and jealousy. We need not indulge in overpolite phrases. This is the only nation which can accept these mandates and maintain international good feeling. It is absolutely our fault if the Turk remains in Europe. The difficulties inherent in the situation can be cured only at the source. The League of Nations, when it comes into being, must not operate exclusively through a central agency at Geneva, because it cannot learn in that way the real difficulties and the wants of dependent peoples. That can be done only in the most direct way, through representatives on the spot. The people, moreover, want to be heard. They are wonderfully relieved after they have had their say. That fact has its touch of pathos, perhaps to some a touch of the ridiculous, but it is a factor of the human equation which we cannot afford to ignore. And if we supply American tribunals, disinterested and just, before which these peoples can state their grievances and their aspirations, we will have taken a long step toward their pacification and stabilization. I hope you enjoyed reading the book All in a Lifetime with me. If you liked this, please remember to like and subscribe. Please visit Odonomy if you want to see different types of videos we produce. For statistics on our videos, visit at Odonomy Call. Happy YouTube travels!